The man known to history as Pharaoh Khufu was born sometime in the second half of the 27th century BC in Old Kingdom ancient Egypt. Khufu's father was most likely Pharaoh Sneferu, as in Old Kingdom Egypt, something akin to primogeniture was practiced, whereby the eldest son of the previous ruler succeeded him upon his death. Since Sneferu had many sons, it would have been very unlikely that one of them did not succeed him. Sneferu was clearly one of the most powerful rulers ancient Egypt had ever seen, and as we will see, his pyramid-building program was a major influence on Khufu. Khufu's mother, if Sneferu was indeed his father, was Queen Hetepheres I. Egyptian rulers practiced polygamy, and Sneferu would have had numerous wives, with Hetepheres perhaps only rising to become a paramount figure at the pharaonic court in the capital, Mennefer, just to the south of modern-day Cairo, when it became evident that her son Khufu would succeed Sneferu one day. Owing to the polygamy practiced by the pharaohs, Khufu had an extensive array of siblings, many of them being half-brothers and half-sisters. The approximations of Khufu's time of birth are based for the most part on lists of ancient Egyptian kings which indicate that his direct predecessor, Pharaoh Sneferu, died around 2590 BC. Since he had reigned for a long time, most likely around 25 years or longer, it is reasonable to assume that Khufu was well into his adult years when he succeeded to the throne, and that as such, he may have been born sometime between 2640 BC and 2620 BC. Unfortunately though, it is not possible to be more exact, given the fragmentary nature and the very limited extent of the sources available for a period of history some 4,600 years ago. Khufu is one of the most famous pharaohs of ancient Egypt, and even people who have never heard of him will be aware of the monument which he had built during his reign, the Great Pyramid of Giza, the largest of the pyramids on the Giza Plateau outside Cairo in Egypt, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and the only one of those 7 wonders still standing today. This enormous monument was built as his tomb, his resting place in death, and a statement of his position as a god on earth in his own time. But Khufu presents something of a historical anomaly. While the Great Pyramid stands as an everlasting testament to his reign, we know very, very little about the man himself. Almost no written records of any kind have survived from this time, as papyrus documents can only survive over such long periods if preserved in unusual circumstances. Through other sources of evidence, however, such as ancient inscriptions on temple and tomb walls, the writings of classical authors, archaeological research, and the enormous block of evidence that the Great Pyramid itself constitutes, a certain amount about Khufu, his life and reign, can be reconstructed. Khufu ruled Egypt during the Old Kingdom period of Egyptian history. Ancient Egyptian history is divided up into nearly a dozen different distinct eras. The first such era was the pre-dynastic period of Egyptian history, running from the late 5th millennium BC down to about 3100 BC. This was a long period in which there was no major centralized polity in Egypt. Furthermore, Lower Egypt around the Nile Delta and Upper Egypt further south along the course of the Nile were not yet united as a kingdom, but a common culture was emerging here, centered on trade, agricultural practices, a religious system, and of course the development of the hieroglyphic writing system late on in the period. The second such period began around 3100 BC, when a ruler by the name of Narmer succeeded in uniting Upper and Lower Egypt under his rule and established the first dynasty of pharaohs. The term pharaoh meaning something akin to great house and initially referring to a palace in which the ruler lived, but subsequently being applied to describe the king himself during the New Kingdom period. These pharaohs were soon being identified as living gods of a sort, a designation which is important to bear in mind when considering how a pharaoh such as Khufu was able to deploy so many resources in Egypt, all with the goal of building himself an elaborate tomb. Narmer and his successors in the 1st and 2nd dynasty reigned down to just beyond 2700 BC in a period known as the Early Dynastic Era. Then, around 2670 BC, the third era of ancient Egyptian history began with the rise of the 3rd dynasty, the Old Kingdom era. The Old Kingdom era would last between around 2670 BC and 2180 BC. It consisted of 6 dynasties, the 3rd dynasty to the 8th dynasty. This was the first period of great cultural flourishing in ancient Egypt, when a powerful centralized state began building brilliant monuments and its powerful armies expanded the state west into what is now Libya, east into the Sinai Peninsula, and south towards Nubia in modern-day Sudan. Khufu belonged to the 4th dynasty, a distinct line of Egyptian pharaohs that ruled between approximately 2630 BC and 2500 BC. We know this because a number of different lists of ancient Egypt's pharaohs have survived, such as the Abydos king list, found on the wall of a temple built by Seti I around 1300 BC. By the time this 4th dynasty came to power, the Old Kingdom was a well-developed state with armies that controlled extensive territory, a large bureaucracy of scribes and administrators that managed complex construction programs and collected taxes, generally in the form of agricultural goods produced on the alluvial soil deposited along the shores of the River Nile every year during its inundation or flooding. A royal capital had also emerged at Men-Nefer, or Memphis, just south of modern-day Cairo and not far from the Giza Plateau and the Dashur necropolis, latter on which a complex of mortuary tombs and pyramids were already being built to house the remains of the pharaohs, members of their families, and leading figures within the government. This was the context in which Khufu would rule Egypt. Depending on which tradition one is reading, one will encounter different names for Khufu. For instance, while Egyptologists and most scholars today use the name Khufu for him, if you pick up a history book written in the middle of the 20th century, you are just as likely to find the builder of the Great Pyramid referred to as Cheops. This is not technically inaccurate, but Cheops was the rendering of his name in ancient Greek, and the version used by ancient Greek writers like Herodotus, to whom we will return shortly. Khufu's proper and full Egyptian name was Khnum Khufu, the Khnum part being the name of an Egyptian deity who in the Old Kingdom period was viewed as being both a god of the River Nile, the waterway which allowed life and civilization to flourish in the otherwise inhospitable desert, and also a creator god of sorts who was said to have molded humanity from clay using a potter's wheel. Khnum would be superseded in importance within the Egyptian religious system in centuries to come by Ra, the sun god, and Amun, but Khnum was much more paramount in the Old Kingdom. Khnum Khufu means protected by Khnum, and the name was intended to indicate that Khufu had the divine blessing of the gods. Another version still of Khufu's name used by Egyptian writers of the latter era was Sufis, a different Hellenic version of Cheops. Just as the time of his birth and the parentage of Khufu are imprecisely known, so too is there uncertainty about when he ascended to the throne, and how long he reigned for. The king lists, such as those at Abydos and elsewhere, differ somewhat in their data, but they all point broadly to Sneferu dying in the early 26th century BC and Khufu succeeding him. We can conservatively say then that he succeeded around 2590 BC. There are differing traditions as well concerning how long Khufu ruled for. One or two anomalies suggest a reign of as much as half a century or longer, though for the most part, the sources agree that he ruled for a period of about 25 to 30 years, so down to around 2565 BC or thereabouts. If this is the case, then extrapolating from all of this, we might conclude that Khufu lived to be a man of about 60 or so years and would have been entering old age by the standards of the time when he died. When he became pharaoh of the Old Kingdom, he was enjoying a period of unprecedented power and prosperity. and was extending its influence into new territories beyond the valley and delta of the River Nile. One such area that Khufu was broadly responsible for was the conquest of the Sinai Peninsula. Lying to the east of Egypt in the region connecting Egypt to the wider Middle East, the Sinai Peninsula was a region that was rich in valuable resources in ancient times, as enormous copper mines were discovered at Timna, while various other minerals were mined here, including gold and turquoise, the former being a mineral which was used extensively in ancient Egyptian jewelry and funerary goods. At Wadi Magare, a site in the southeast of the Sinai Peninsula, there are mines and caves that are the remnants of the mining activity undertaken here in ancient times, ones in which cartouche reliefs of Khufu have been found, indicating that he sent mining expeditions here during his reign. There is also evidence of further trade connections being cultivated between Egypt and the Levant during his rule to acquire goods, such as the valuable byblos wood produced here. Archaeologists have also located a fort known as Tel Ras Boudran in western Sinai. This lay across the Gulf of Suez from the port of Wadi Magare, and it has been speculated that mined resources were being shipped across the Gulf and then transported overland to Men Nefer during Khufu's reign. The riverine transport links between Sinai and the west of the Gulf of Suez point towards the growing Egyptian presence along the Red Sea coastline. In the pre-dynastic and early dynastic era, the rulers of the Egyptian kingdom had been focused on extending their control along the course of the River Nile and uniting Upper and Lower Egypt fully under their rule. With this completed, the next logical phase of expansion was west and eastwards into the oases of the Western Desert and to the Red Sea coast. There are numerous settlement sites along the Red Sea coast which point towards increased activity here during Khufu's reign. A very notable one is at Wadi al-Jaf, about 100 kilometers south along the Red Sea coast from the modern-day town of Suez. Here, the oldest known artificial harbour anywhere in the world was built right around the time of Khufu's reign, while dozens of anchors dating to the Old Kingdom period have also been excavated from the seabed, indicating a very high level of maritime traffic in Khufu's time. While the evidence is typically fragmentary, the overwhelming sense conveyed by sites like Wadi al-Jaf is of a growing level of prosperity and commerce here in Khufu's reign. Because members of the royal family were interred after death in elaborate tombs and often had their names inscribed on temple walls or on other public monuments, we are able to reconstruct Khufu's family to some extent. Like virtually all pharaohs, he had multiple wives. The senior queen was Meritites I, who was most likely a half-sister of Khufu's, it also being a common practice over 3,000 years of ancient Egyptian history for siblings to marry one another to secure the royal line. Her paramount position amongst Khufu's wives is evident from the building of a small pyramid in honor of her, not far from the Great Pyramid on the Giza Plateau. Another wife, Hernutsen, is listed on the inventory stela, a stone tablet dating from the 7th century BC, which purports to list statues from a temple first built in Egypt during the Old Kingdom period. These wives, and perhaps other unknown wives, bore Khufu at least a dozen children. The eldest son was Kawab, who might otherwise have become pharaoh one day, but predeceased his father. Another son was Khafre, who would become the most significant of his sons. A daughter, Neferti Arbet, meaning beautiful one of the East, has her own important place in the history of the Old Kingdom on account of a slab stela from her tomb at Giza having survived in a remarkable state of preservation. This is replete with hieroglyphs and depicts her seated and eating. Despite having occurred nearly 5 millennia ago, we are fortunate to have a few pieces of material evidence that have survived from Khufu's reign to shed light on him and his court. One of these is known as the Westcar Papyrus, so called because it was acquired by a British adventurer by the name of Henry Westcar while in Egypt in the mid-1820s. Unfortunately, we do not know how Westcar acquired it or where it was preserved, as it is exceptionally rare that a papyrus manuscript could have survived so long without literally disintegrating just by being exposed to the air. The papyrus comes from the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, but is a collection of 5 stories about miracles that were performed by magicians and priests at Khufu's court, with these tales described as King Khufu and the magicians within the text. The stories are each related to one of Khufu's sons. Only the 4th relates directly to the king and outlines the tale of a man who could reattach the heads to animals and bring them back to life after they were beheaded. Khufu had this ancient Egyptian reanimator brought to his court to demonstrate this magic, and there the pharaoh has numerous animals and even a servant beheaded in order for the magician to demonstrate his skill. On the one hand, the picture here presented of Khufu is fairly unflattering. He has animals and a person murdered and beheaded before him in order to test the skill of the magician. But other Egyptologists have pointed out that the story is trying to portray Khufu as an inquisitive ruler, curious about magic and possible religious powers. Another artifact which has survived to shed light on Khufu is the Khufu statuette. This is a remarkable survival. It is a very small ivory statue depicting Khufu and purportedly dating to the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. Though many prominent Egyptologists have expressed skepticism that it dates to Khufu's own time. It shows the pharaoh seated on a throne and wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt. We know it is meant to depict the pharaoh, as a cartouche on the side of the statue gives his name as Khnum Khufu, the god name of the king. Found in 1903 by Sir Flinders Petrie, a British archaeologist who pioneered many modern methods of rigorous archaeology, it is housed today in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Beyond this material culture, we have numerous works from antiquity which discuss Khufu and his reign, though even these are set at a significant remove away from the pharaoh's own time. One such writer is Manetho, an Egyptian priest and scholar of the 3rd century BC, who composed a major study of the pharaohs of Egypt entitled Egyptica, or History of Egypt. His writings have only survived in fragmentary form, but one section addresses Khufu, whom he called Sufis I. We know that he was referring to Khufu as he listed him as being the 2nd pharaoh of the 4th dynasty, which Khufu indeed was. In general, Manetho's account is hard to take at face value. While Khufu did reign for several decades, Manetho claimed he did so for 63 years, far too long to match with the archaeological record or the other extant king lists. He does state that Khufu, quote, reared the Great Pyramid. Intriguingly, Manetho claimed that the pharaoh was contemptuous of the gods early on in his reign, but that he then made amends for his actions by composing a sacred book. Egyptologists generally doubt this assertion, as Egyptian kings were not known to write books of any kind generally, and certainly not so early in Egyptian history, but one wonders what tradition Manetho was drawing on in stating this about Khufu. Manetho cited a Greek writer of the 5th century BC in his short passage on Khufu, noting that Herodotus, the father of history, famous for authoring the Histories, an account of the rise of the Persian Empire and the Persian invasions of Greece in the early 5th century BC, referred to a pharaoh called Cheops as being the builder of the Great Pyramid. Manetho did not realize that Cheops was the Greek name for Khufu. The first half of Herodotus's Histories is actually a mix of geography, anthropology, and fantastical stories which describe the known world at that time and the people in it. In the midst of this, Herodotus turns to consider Khufu, claiming that he had been informed by the priests of Egypt that the country had been well governed until the reign of Khufu, who then, quote, brought the people to utter misery by shutting up all the temples so that none could sacrifice there. And next, he compelled all the Egyptians to work for him, appointing some to drag stones from the quarries in the Arabian mountains to the Nile. He went on to suggest that such was Khufu's love of money and power that he had even prostituted one of his daughters to make money from her, though we can probably discount Herodotus's claim that each of the stones used in the Great Pyramid of Cheops was donated by one of her customers. Herodotus's account needs to be taken with a healthy degree of skepticism, given how fantastical some of the material in his histories was. But it is interesting that he claimed he had learned all of this from the priests of Egypt, who passed on these traditions and knowledge from generation to generation. Herodotus was not alone in portraying Khufu in this manner. In the 1st century BC, a Greek historian from Sicily, Diodorus Siculus, composed an enormous history of the world called the Bibliotheca Historica, the Library of History. Only 15 of the 40 books into which this was divided have survived, but amongst those that we still have today was a section on Khufu, referring to his as Chemis, a derivation of the Greek Cheops. He notes that he built the largest of the 3 great pyramids at Giza, a complex which Diodorus noted was already considered one of the 7 wonders of the world at that time. Diodorus marveled at how the pyramids could have been built without any evidence being left behind of the construction work. Yet he concurred with Herodotus that Khufu was a tyrant who had committed what he termed many cruel and violent acts, and under whom the Egyptians suffered many hardships. It should be noted in saying this that both Herodotus and Diodorus were deeply confused about the dating of Khufu's reign, claiming it came after the Ramesside period of Egyptian history, during which a long succession of pharaohs, generally all called Ramesses, ruled. This Ramesside era occurred in the 13th and 12th centuries BC, nearly a millennia and a half after Khufu's time, so both Herodotus and Diodorus were completely wrong in this. Though Diodorus did note that another tradition held that the pyramids had been built over 3,000 years earlier, a dating which was much more accurate. While each of these ancient accounts need to be treated with caution, it is interesting that there was a unanimous sense, whether in the writings of Herodotus, Manetho, or Diodorus, that Khufu had been an oppressive tyrant. This alleged tyranny was all connected to the foremost accomplishment of Khufu's reign, the building of the Great Pyramid of Giza. At the time of his birth, the building of pyramids to act as tombs for deceased pharaohs had been underway for about a century. The first pharaoh to do so was Pharaoh Djoser of the 3rd dynasty, when he had the step pyramid built at Saqqara to the south of modern-day Cairo. This stood over 60 meters high and was built in 6 large tiers. Were it not for what followed it, it would be considered an enormous achievement for an ancient civilization, but it would soon be dwarfed by the more impressive pyramids. Sneferu, who is believed to have been Khufu's father and the founder of the 4th dynasty, was responsible for building 3 pyramids during his long reign, which foreshadowed the work of Khufu. These were the Pyramid of Meidum, the Red Pyramid, and the Bent Pyramid. Of these, the Red Pyramid and the Bent Pyramid are the most elaborate, both reaching over 100 meters in height. The Red Pyramid was the most sophisticated pyramid built in Egypt up to that time, being a true pyramid in terms of its mathematical proportions, although the Bent Pyramid has a point of interest in terms of its unusual shape, and in that it is the only pyramid extant in Egypt today that retains a substantial amount of its limestone casing. Not all pyramids from early on in the Old Kingdom era were as accomplished. Some were rough mounds, and some collapsed either during the reigns of their rulers or not long after, indicating that by the time Khufu came to the throne, there had been an extended period of trial and error when it came to pyramid construction, which he was the beneficiary of. Sneferu was clearly obsessive about pyramid construction, not just in that he was responsible for ordering the construction of several pyramids, but also because he moved on to build new ones, always in search of a more anatomically sophisticated structure. If Khufu was his son, it is interesting to speculate that he inherited his interest in pyramids from his father, perhaps visiting the site of the Bent and Red Pyramid as they were under construction on the Dar Shur necropolis during his childhood. It was not far away where Khufu elected to begin building a new complex on the Giza Plateau, a necropolis which towers over the River Nile Valley below and which would have made the pyramid he chose to build here look particularly imposing in ancient times. Khufu's pyramid would also dwarf his father's. The Great Pyramid stood over 146 meters high when it was built, while the structure was a perfect square on the base, measuring 230 meters on each side. To put that in perspective, it is about 2.5 times longer than the average modern football field and 5 times wider. The sheer amount of the material used to build Khufu's Great Pyramid was staggering. It has been estimated that the core of the pyramid consisted of 2.3 million blocks, many measuring well over a meter on the sides and weighing an average of about 2.5 tons per block. That means that over 6 million tons of stone needed to be quarried, cut and moved into position, although the process was made slightly easier by the fact that the stones were not uniform in size or smoothly finished. Instead, they were fitted together as well as they could be, and mortar was used to bind them thereafter. Much of the material involved was limestone, which was cut out of quarries near the Giza Plateau itself. However, some of the stone was brought vast distances to Giza. 8,000 tons of granite, for instance, was used in certain sections of the pyramid, and this type of rock was not available near Giza or the capital Men-Nefer nearby. Thus, 8,000 tons of granite blocks were quarried at Aswan, way up the River Nile, in what is now southern Egypt, and transported north over 850 kilometers to Giza. The stones involved were then assembled into 216 different layers of blocks, averaging 2/3 of a meter in height each. Given the enormous amount of blocks involved, the sheer weight of the construction materials, and the labor which was needed to build this colossal monument, how was such a construction project achieved, and who performed the building process itself? This is a question that has fascinated Egyptologists and anyone with an interest in ancient Egypt for centuries. Because of the sheer manpower involved and the apparent drudgery of the labor, a common misconception which emerged centuries ago and which still holds some sway today is that the pyramids were built by a small army of slaves. Whilst an understandable conclusion to reach, the archaeological evidence, which includes a workers' village uncovered in the Giza area to the southeast of the Great Pyramid itself back in the late 1980s, points towards the builders of the pyramids being paid laborers who actually lived reasonably well, with the average worker eating considerably better than others in Egyptian society at the time. Their protein intake was certainly higher. As to how many laborers were involved, it is hard to tell, as seasonal workers may have been drafted in at certain times. Diodorus Siculus argued that 360,000 workers were involved. Herodotus claimed that 100,000 were employed in shifts of 3 months at a time. While these are suppositions made 2 millennia after Khufu's own time, there is no doubt that the pharaoh was footing the bill for at least tens of thousands of workers to erect his pyramid. It is the only way that a monument this size could have been built given the technology available at the time. In recent decades, more scientific approaches to determining the size of the workforce involved have been utilized, specifically by actually having people use the tools that were available at the time and to try and cut out the sort of 2.5-ton limestone blocks that make up the majority of the Great Pyramid. This approach was aided enormously by the discovery back in the mid-2010s of a complete quarried block and some ancient tools in a limestone quarry dating to Khufu's reign. Using precise replicas of these tools, a team determined that it would take 4 workers 3 8-hour days to quarry and carve out one of these 2.5-ton blocks. However, if they employed water to wet the stone, the process could be accelerated significantly, though it is doubtful that the kind of water necessary to do so could have been made available. All in all, the team determined that a labor force of 3,500 workers on site at this quarry would have been able to produce 250 blocks every day. Double this number to 7,000 workers producing 500 blocks per day, and it would have taken about 13 years to produce all the blocks needed for the Great Pyramid. This is an entirely feasible analysis, though clearly if you had 7,000 men working on quarrying and stone cutting alone, this would only constitute a proportion of the entire workforce, as others would be needed to transport the stone from the quarries to Giza and to work at the pyramid site itself. while others still would be working in an ancillary capacity, producing tools, transporting food and water for the workers, and so on and so forth. A study which has just appeared in 2024 has added a further piece of evidence to explain how the pyramids were built on the Giza Plateau. This revealed that a 64-kilometer branch of the River Nile, known as the Ahramat Nile branch, one which dried up several thousand years ago and was buried under farmland, once flowed from the main River Nile to Giza, allowing workers to transport the blocks by river to close to the building site. It was an enormous operation, no matter how you look at it, but achievable. Incredibly, a diary of sorts kept by an overseer of some of the workmen, a man named Merer, has survived. Merer was a mid-ranking official who was responsible for a team of workmen operating at the Tura quarries, where limestone blocks were being quarried and cut to the southeast of Giza. His diary itemizes the cutting of blocks and the teams involved in working on the pyramid, or what was described by Merer as Aket Khufu, meaning the horizon of Khufu. Further details outline transportation of the blocks by boat and the cost of food and other materials. Not all of the diary of Merer, which was found buried near a cave at the Wadi al-Jaf on the Red Sea coast of Egypt in 2013, and which is written in hieroglyphs constituting the oldest papyrus text to have survived in the world, have been deciphered yet, and it might reveal more about the construction of the Great Pyramid in due course. Some of the issues concerning the construction of the pyramids have been a source of unending debate, notably where the stones came from and how they were lifted into place. Diodorus commented on this in his Bibliotheca. He noted that many people were of the view that the stones that were used to build the pyramid had been dragged all the way from Arabia, while they had been lifted into place using enormous ramps, as cranes of any kind which might be able to lift such enormous blocks had not yet been invented. We know that for the most part the stones involved were actually quarried in the wider Giza region and were not brought from afar, although the granite blocks used were transported considerable distances. The issue of how the blocks were raised is much more contentious. Many scholars contend that a ramp of some kind was used, along which the laborers dragged the stones at an elevation. However, in order for it to be possible to drag stones which weighed 2.5 tons, particularly to the higher sections of the pyramid, the ramp would have to have been around a mile long and would have been larger in size than the pyramid itself. Furthermore, space is limited on the Giza Plateau, a necropolis with a fairly sheer cliff face. As such, it would have been difficult to build such a ramp here. Egyptologists still cannot agree on how the Great Pyramid was actually constructed, with new theories emerging in recent decades to suggest water power was employed to move the stones. One of the more interesting accounts of the building of the pyramids comes from Herodotus. He claimed that Khufu first had great roads constructed all the way from Arabia to Egypt, and then the quarried rock was brought overland, with some transported by sea. He further claimed that the work was seasonal, with 100,000 men working at any given time in rotating shifts of 3 months, a system which suggests a perception that these were not slaves. The Greek historian claimed the road alone took 10 years to build and describes it in such a way as to suggest that the remains of the road were still visible in his time 2 millennia after Khufu's reign. Turning to the Great Pyramid itself, Herodotus was knowledgeable enough to know that there were underground chambers in it. His belief was that the pyramid took 20 years to build and that the stone slabs were lifted up from tier to tier using giant wooden logs, which he referred to as levers. Finally, in Herodotus's time, there were still hieroglyphics on the outside, which spoke about the range of foodstuffs that were necessary to feed the workmen, with an Egyptian interpreter telling Herodotus that 1,600 talents of silver had been spent on feeding the workers alone. An Attic talent at Herodotus's time of writing weighed just over 25 kilograms, so this would suggest that 40 tons of silver were needed to buy all the food which fed the workmen who built the Great Pyramid, before other construction costs were ever taken into account. The most striking element of all of this is that any of it happened at all. Given the sheer amount of labor involved and the secondary labor needed to supply the workers with food, tools, and other resources, a substantial proportion of Egyptian society was effectively co-opted into building an enormous tomb for one man. The explanation for this is that many Egyptians by the 4th dynasty were used to viewing kings like Khufu as semi-divine beings. The Egyptian religious system was already gearing around identifying members of the royal family as being earthly manifestations of the gods, hence Khufu's broader name Khnum Khufu. It was this idealization of the pharaohs as being the gods in human form that allowed a society like Old Kingdom Egypt to dedicate the resources necessary to construct such an enormous monument. In doing so, the idea of the kings as celestial beings became self-fulfilling. Imagine the impression it must have made on individuals in the mid-3rd millennium BC, when they traveled to the capital, Men-Nefer, and saw Khufu's enormous pyramid tomb towering over the River Nile on top of the Giza Plateau. It is still an awe-inspiring spectacle today, in an age of skyscrapers and space travel. To a person over 4.5 millennia ago, it would have reinforced the perception of the king as a divine being. This view was attested to in antiquity, with Diodorus noting of the blocks used that they, quote, do not have the appearance of being the slow handiwork of men, but look like a sudden creation, as though they had been made by some god and set down bodily in the surrounding sand. Khufu did not simply order the construction of an enormous pyramid of blocks on top of the Giza Plateau. There is a highly complex series of shafts, chambers, and tunnels inside the Great Pyramid. These are accessed through an entrance that was left in the exterior roughly 17 meters above the base of the pyramid. This then leads off into other passageways and chambers, some of which are extremely narrow, and the exact purpose or symbolism of which are still intensely debated. One is the subterranean chamber, which was actually cut down into the bedrock below the pyramid, so that it now is over 25 meters below the base of the Great Pyramid. It is an extensive chamber, measuring over 8 meters by 14 meters, with a large pit. What the purpose of it was meant to be is unclear, though one theory is that Khufu had originally intended for this to be his burial chamber, but later changed his mind and ordered the incorporation of a chamber for his sarcophagus and grave goods much higher up within the pyramid proper. Another room much further up is the Queen's Chamber, a somewhat misleading title, as it is not at all clear if it was intended that one of Khufu's wives would be interred here. One of the more mysterious elements of the Queen's Chamber are a series of very small shafts running out from it, ones which cannot be entered or explored by humans and which have only begun to reveal their secrets as a result of the use of modern technology in recent years. The most widely discussed part of the interior of the Great Pyramid is the King's Chamber and the passages and rooms surrounding it. This was a room measuring roughly 10.5 meters by 5 meters, with a flat ceiling 6 meters high. It is found roughly a third of the way up the pyramid, the base of the King's Chamber lying around 46 meters above the base of the pyramid itself. The construction of the chamber is fascinating. The roof is made out of 9 enormous granite blocks, which were brought all the way from Aswan in southern Egypt and which weigh between 25 and 80 tons. The process of trying to get 80-ton blocks some 60 meters up to near the midway point of the pyramid and then lowering them down onto the roof of the King's Chamber was one of the engineering marvels of history. Unfortunately though, the splendor of the King's Chamber is otherwise lost to us. Despite the inclusion of an antechamber which was designed to fend off would-be robbers, when the King's Chamber was reopened in modern times, everything except a granite sarcophagus that would have once housed Khufu's remains had long since been pilfered by thieves, and the sarcophagus itself was broken. The riches of this chamber in antiquity must have been immense, when we consider that Khufu was a great ruler at the height of the Old Kingdom, whereas the only intact pharaonic tomb that has ever been found, that of the New Kingdom ruler Tutankhamun, contained immense wealth in the burial chamber of a relatively minor king. From the King's Chamber, there are further chambers and passages. These include the star shafts, two narrow ducts which run all the way from the king's chamber to the exterior of the Great Pyramid. They run upwards at angles and point into the sky and the stars at night. The purpose of them is contentious. One theory suggests that the south shaft may have pointed towards the star constellation Orion's Belt in ancient times. Other Egyptologists have proposed more pedestrian explanations, claiming that these were just air ventilation shafts used so that workers could breathe while working on the chambers during the construction period. However, there are no such star shafts on any other Old Kingdom pyramids, and so this theory seems unlikely. The most plausible explanation is that the shafts, of which two more flow outwards from the Queen's chamber, were designed to point towards stars and constellations, which Khufu and the Old Kingdom Egyptians considered to be particularly important in their cosmology, notably Orion's Belt, Sirius or the Dog Star, and Alpha Draconis, the latter of which would have been close to the North Celestial Pole in the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. A visitor to Giza today is presented with a sight which is quite different from what Khufu would have beheld when he arrived on the plateau to view his pyramid when work was completed in the 26th century BC. Today, one sees the layers of limestone blocks exposed and a rather flat top to the pyramid, but the original finish was much different. For starters, the entire outside of the pyramid was encased in white limestone, which was then finished by workmen to give the entire pyramid a smooth, polished finish. At the very peak, there would have stood a pyramidion, a capstone that gave the whole pyramid a pointed top, and which would have made an impressive finish to it, one that glittered in the warm Sahara sun. This pyramidion, contrary to popular belief, would not have been made of gold or electrum, a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver, nor was it gilded by putting gold casing around the outside of the pyramidion. In later times, some pyramidions were produced in Egypt which were gilded, but in the 4th dynasty the pyramidions were generally made from smooth limestone or some other well-worked and polished stone. We know this because while the pyramidion from Khufu's Great Pyramid has long since been lost, several others from 4th dynasty pyramids are extant and they are not made of gold. When the pyramidion from Khufu's Great Pyramid was lost is unclear, but Pliny the Elder, the Roman encyclopedist of 1st century AD, noted that it was gone by his time. The limestone casing collapsed off of the Great Pyramid owing to natural disasters, such as the 1303 Great Earthquake of Crete, and was carried away and reused to build mosques and other buildings in Cairo over the centuries. Estimates vary as to how long it took for the Great Pyramid to be constructed, but a conservative estimate is around 20 years, though others suggest that the incomplete nature of some of the inner chambers suggest that it was still not fully complete when Khufu died sometime in or around 2565 BC. We can assume that he was buried in great splendor, with a mass of gold and bejeweled funerary goods, while after elaborate religious ceremonies his mummified body was placed in the sarcophagus in the king's chamber. However, everything, including his mummy, was pilfered at some point in antiquity or during the medieval era. Another tradition holds that Khufu was not interred at all in the Great Pyramid, which he had employed such great resources on the construction of. Diodorus Siculus stated that Khufu was so loathed at the end of his reign for his tyrannous rule that he enjoined his family to bury him instead in an unmarked grave, as the people in their anger would enter his tomb and defile his mummy if he was laid to rest in the Great Pyramid. This is highly implausible, given that the passages and entry points would have been sealed up after the interment of a pharaoh within them, and it was only by burrowing a large tunnel, now referred to as the Robber's Tunnel, that people in centuries gone by were able to enter the king's chamber and pilfer it. Khufu seems to have been succeeded by his son Djedefre, though it is also possible that he only co-ruled with his father for a time and died before Khufu himself. Regardless of whether he ruled on his own briefly after his father died, the various king lists which have survived agree that Djedefre's rule was brief and he was eventually succeeded by another of Khufu's sons, Khafre. Khafre ruled for a long time like his father, and he also emulated Khufu in erecting a great pyramid on the Giza Plateau. His is the second largest of the three great pyramids, standing just in the shadow of his father's tomb, while the consensus today among Egyptologists is that Khafre was responsible for erecting the Sphinx here as well, with the head of the half-man, half-lion statue being an image of Khufu's son. A son of Khafre's, Menkaure, would later add the third and last of the three great pyramids there. The other, smaller pyramids are those of Egyptian queens, while further excavation work in modern times has revealed that there were hundreds of other stone and brick mastaba tombs built at Giza to house the remains of the extended royal families of the Old Kingdom and senior priests and government officials. Not long after Menkaure's death, around 2500 BC, the Fourth Dynasty came to an end, perhaps following the death of a son, Shepseskaf, who ruled as pharaoh down to around 2496 BC. The Fifth Dynasty followed thereafter as a new imperial family rose to rule in Egypt. The Fourth Dynasty is generally deemed to have been the peak of Old Kingdom Egypt, although the Old Kingdom continued down to beyond 2200 BC when civil war split Upper and Lower Egypt, leading to a century-and-a-half-long era of decline known as the First Intermediate Period. The Great Pyramid of Khufu captured the imagination of writers and travelers even in ancient times, as the discussion of it by figures like Manetho, Herodotus, and Diodorus Siculus indicates. There were many other writers who discussed it, though without mentioning anything about its alleged builder. For instance, Pliny the Elder, a Roman encyclopedist of the 1st century AD, in his Historia Naturalis, remarked on the internal passages and how he believed there was a well inside the pyramid which reached down far enough to access the water table of the River Nile. He also stated that Thales, one of the great early Greek philosophers and scientists who hailed from the city of Miletus in Asia Minor in the 6th century BC, had traveled to Egypt and had carried out mathematical observations there using the shadows cast by the sun on the pyramid, almost as though it were a great sundial. Before Pliny's time, the Greek poet Antipater of Sidon, writing in the early 1st century BC, included the Great Pyramid on his list of the 7 wonders of the world. The 7 wonders are generally derived from Antipater's list, and it included the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the statue of Zeus, and the others that we are familiar with. All of the other 6 wonders of the world were destroyed at various times in antiquity or thereafter. The exception was the Great Pyramid. Part of the reason why it was so undisturbed was that there were few major wars in Egypt itself in antiquity, and there was an incredible continuity of culture in the land of the Nile between Khufu's time down to the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the beginning of Roman rule here in the 1st century BC. As such, the people and priests here revered the old tombs, pyramids, and temples century after century and protected them. This situation changed with the advent of Arab rule in the 7th century, as the followers of Muhammad burst out of Arabia and conquered the Middle East and North Africa. One of the rulers of the Arab Caliphate, Al-Ma'mun, is understood to have ordered his followers to blow a hole in the side of Khufu's pyramid and to tunnel into it in the early 9th century. At least Al-Ma'mun was simply inquisitive. Much more nefarious were the actions of the governor of Egypt in the late 12th century, Al-Aziz Uthman, a son of the Muslim warlord Saladin. Uthman decided that he would destroy the pyramids in a fit of iconoclastic religiosity which aimed to get rid of these false idols. Fortunately, his engineers failed to do so and only succeeded in damaging the pyramid of Menkaure, the smallest of the 3 pyramids on the Giza Plateau. In more recent times, natural disasters have been more troublesome. In 1303, the Great Earthquake caused such devastation that it cracked and knocked off a large amount of the casing around the pyramid, an event which incidentally did much to destroy one of the remaining wonders of the world as well, the Lighthouse of Alexandria. Despite a common misperception that they badly damaged the pyramids and the Sphinx on the Giza Plateau during their expedition to the country under Napoleon Bonaparte at the end of the 18th century, There is no concrete evidence to suggest the French damaged anything at the Giza complex. What they did do was initiate the modern discipline of Egyptology, which over time has led to preservation work being undertaken extensively at Giza. Unfortunately, though, the site is still susceptible to natural disasters, and another earthquake in 1992, the epicenter of which was in the suburbs of Cairo, damaged the Great Pyramid, causing it to shrink by several feet as blocks caved in internally. Given the level of interest in Khufu's tomb over the 4.5 millennia since it was built, one would think that it had revealed all of its secrets long ago. But this certainly isn't the case. The Great Pyramid was built in such a way that passages and shafts were covered up by subsequent layers and made inaccessible for humans. As such, parts of it simply cannot be accessed unless one were to systematically dismantle the pyramid. Therefore, Egyptologists are still working today to try to uncover all of its secrets and to determine what the purpose of the shafts and tunnels inside it were and how the whole thing was built. New scientific methods, for instance by using small robots and cameras to investigate parts of the pyramid which simply cannot be accessed by humans, are being employed all the time and are throwing up new discoveries. As recently as March 2023, a new 30-foot-long corridor was revealed using infrared thermography and other technologies. Khufu's mysterious tomb continues to fascinate in the early 3rd millennium AD. As the foregoing has outlined, there is far more about the pharaoh Khufu that we don't know than what we do know. From the king lists and other ancient sources, it is clear that he ruled Egypt as part of the 4th dynasty around 2600 BC, while there is also no disputing that he was responsible for building the greatest of the pyramids on the Giza plateau as his tomb. But beyond this, very little else can be said about him with certainty. He was evidently one of the strongest rulers of Old Kingdom Egypt, expanding the kingdom's control further into the Sinai Peninsula and towards the Red Sea. Other issues are more speculative. Perhaps he was a ruler who had little respect for the gods and who tyrannized his people into building him a great tomb, much as later Greek writers claimed, but it is just as plausible that these are elaborate myths that developed in the centuries between Khufu's time and that of Herodotus and others. Then again, perhaps it is just as fitting that we know so little about Khufu, the mystery of his life correlating with the many mysteries of the pyramid which he had built, and which still towers over Cairo today, a testament to the dawn of civilization on the banks of the River Nile. What do you think of Pharaoh Khufu? How is it possible that during his reign, a society that had only so recently emerged as a Bronze Age culture could start to build an enormous monument such as the Great Pyramid of Giza? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
The man known to history as Ramesses the Great, known simply as Ramesses in his lifetime, was born in the late 14th century BC. Scholars tend to hold that he was most likely born in the year 1303 BC, but there is no extant information as to his exact date of birth. His father was a member of a leading aristocratic and military family, which hailed from the northern part of Egypt, probably from one of the several fortified urban centers of the Nile River Delta. His original name is unclear, but he would later become known as Seti I, as we will see. Ramesses' mother was Tuya, the daughter of a military officer named Raya, and so a member of the Egyptian military nobility herself. Ramesses was born into a world that had been going through one of the first golden ages of ancient times. This was the height of the Bronze Age, and powerful centralized states had emerged in many parts of the eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. The Greek world was dominated by powers like the Mycenae on the mainland and the Minoans on the island of Crete, and throughout this time, complex literary and artistic societies were beginning to emerge in ways which would shape the ancient world for centuries to come. In what is now Turkey, the powerful Hittite Empire had emerged, centered on the city of Hattusa. Shortly before Ramesses' birth, It had begun conquering parts of the Levant and Mesopotamia, and was effectively Egypt's most significant rival for power in the region. Further to the southeast, a number of significant states existed in Mesopotamia proper and Persia, notably the Babylonian Empire and the Assyrian Empire. Each of these polities was wealthy, had complex bureaucracies, and was engaged in extensive trade across this Bronze Age world. For instance, a trader or merchant in a city like Tyre or Sidon in the Levant in the 14th century BC could purchase pottery from Knossos in Crete, olive oil from Athens in Greece, papyrus from Egypt, and textiles from Mesopotamia and Persia, all bought and sold in copper, gold, and silver, mined in places like western Anatolia under the Hittites' control, or Cyprus, a major center of copper mining, a necessity in order to make bronze chariots, weapons, and other utensils. Egypt itself was no exception to this story of prosperity. This was an era known as the New Kingdom period, one which had begun in the 16th century BC, and which would extend beyond Ramesses' own time. The term New Kingdom is a relatively modern construct, having been coined in the 19th century, but it is typically accepted by Egyptologists as accurately describing a distinct period of Bronze Age culture in Egypt, which was more prosperous than anything which had preceded it there, even the Old Kingdom culture of the pharaohs who built the Great Pyramids at Giza a millennium earlier. During this New Kingdom period, the pharaohs developed a powerful government overseen by viziers and many scribes. A large military was also kept at the ready, powered by new technologies such as chariots and weapons made of bronze. With all this in train, the pharaohs were not only able to collect a greater amount of taxes and govern more efficiently at home, but the New Kingdom Empire expanded in all directions, with outposts being established further down the River Nile than ever before into what is now Sudan, but which was then known as Nubia, and a growing amount of territory being acquired on the Sinai Peninsula and northwards into Canaan and Lebanon. This empire had reached a particular peak in the 15th century BC, during the long reign of Pharaoh Thutmose III, whose conquests extended the Egyptian kingdom northeast into parts of modern-day Syria and northern Iraq. Little is known about the specifics of Ramesses' own childhood, but the political developments of the time were extremely significant. At the time he was born, Egypt was ruled by Pharaoh Horemheb, a member of the 18th dynasty of Egyptian pharaohs. Horemheb is known for having restored a certain amount of stability to Egypt's domestic politics after a tumultuous period during which a near predecessor, Akhenaten, had attempted to establish a monotheistic cult of the sun, replacing the traditional religious and political structures of Egypt. This caused enormous unrest within Egypt and led to its decline as an international power. Horemheb reversed many of these decisions and quelled the unrest Akhenaten had created along the course of the River Nile, but he appears to have had no surviving sons and no biological successor. As such, he decided to designate the head of his government, the Grand Vizier Paramesse, as his successor. Paramesse was Ramesses' grandfather, and so the family ascended to become the 19th dynasty of Egyptian pharaohs when Paramesse became the pharaoh, adopting the regnal name Ramesses I around 1292 BC. He ruled for just a few short years before his death, at which time Ramesses' father succeeded him as second pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, adopting the name Seti I in honor of Seth, the Egyptian god of war. Ramesses was now the heir to the throne of New Kingdom Egypt, as he was soon appointed as Prince Regent by his father, who would reign for just over a decade, during which time he began to re-establish Egyptian control over some of the territory which had been held to the northeast in Canaan and Syria under earlier rulers such as Thutmose III, but which had been lost as a result of the divided state of the kingdom during Akhenaten's reign and religious reforms. Ramesses doubtless accompanied his father in some of his campaigns northeast of the Levant and gained valuable military experience during his time as Prince Regent. He would soon need this experience, as he ascended to the throne as a relatively young man. He is known to have become pharaoh on the 27th day of the season of the harvest in a particular year of his father's reign, one which is believed to equate to an accession date of the 31st of May 1279 BC. He would reign for the next 66 years in what is typically accounted as the most significant reign of any Egyptian pharaoh, adopting the full regnal name Uzema Atres et Epenre, meaning roughly the law or harmony of Ra. The Egyptian sun god is powerful. I am chosen of Ra. Ramesses' first major act as the new ruler of Egypt was to deal with a threat which had been growing in the northern parts of the kingdom for several years. Even before his accession, sea pirates known as the Sherden Sea Pirates had been raiding the northern coast of the kingdom into the River Nile Delta from the eastern Mediterranean. This was one of the most prosperous and important parts of Ramesses' kingdom, and it was vital that these encroachments be stopped. Thus, beginning in the second year of his reign, he began establishing forts along the northern coast of the kingdom and northeastwards towards Sinai and Canaan. New ships were also constructed to patrol the waters of the eastern Mediterranean, and warning posts were set up to signal to larger settlements when raiding parties were making their way towards the Egyptian kingdom. All of this culminated in a major sea battle, in which Ramesses and his navy were victorious. A stele or memorial stone commemorating this at Tanis in the northeast of the Nile Delta has survived down to modern times and provides evidence of this victory today, but the exact details of how it occurred or what it involved, other than that Ramesses scored an early victory, remain unclear. Having stabilized the northern shores of Egypt and the Nile Delta, Ramesses' primary aim became to restore Egyptian control over Canaan and other parts of the Levant as had existed in earlier times. This was a paramount concern. While Egypt itself was an affluent land based on the bounteous agriculture practiced along the shores of the River Nile and the production of pottery and papyrus in cities like Thebes and Memphis, the most affluent cities in the late Bronze Age world lay in Canaan, cities like Tyre and Sidon, which were at the crossroads of all the major empires and were major trading centers as a result. Consequently, Ramesses was anxious to restore Egyptian rule over the region, as had existed 2 centuries earlier in the time of Thutmose III. However, while there was no state with an army sufficient to withstand Egypt within Canaan and the southern reaches of the Levant, the region was also coveted by the Hittite Empire to the north. Much of Ramesses' rule would be concerned with trying to seize control of this region and stave off counterattacks by the Hittites. In the course of doing so, he would fight arguably the most significant battle in the history of the Bronze Age. One of Ramesses' first actions early in his reign was to construct a new capital in the northeastern parts of the Nile Delta, in an effort to increase Egyptian power to the northeast into the Levant. The capital of pharaonic Egypt had moved around over the centuries. For instance, in ancient times during the Old Kingdom period, it lay at Memphis, near what is now Cairo. However, the capital during the New Kingdom period was typically located well down the River Nile, at what was known then as Thebes, but which we call Luxor today. Akhenaten, the controversial pharaoh who, a half-century before Ramesses' birth, had attempted to establish a monotheistic religion centered on the worship of Aten, had established a new capital at Amarna as a center of the new religion. Thus, there was a substantial precedent for moving the capital of the pharaonic kingdom. Ramesses named his new capital Piramses, near what is now the town of Qantir. Ramesses' father, Seti I, had previously had a summer palace in the region, and it seems likely that Ramesses had spent much of his youth here. Now, in the 1270s, he established it as a quasi-military capital with large workshops and factories erected to begin churning out significant quantities of weapons, armor, and chariots. As such, Piramses became a kind of administrative capital of Lower Egypt, but as we will see from Ramesses' building program, he never abandoned the belief that Thebes or Luxor was the religious and spiritual capital of Egypt. In the earliest part of his wars against the Hittites, Ramesses faced King Muwatalli II, the ruler of the Hittite Empire, since the mid-1290s. This Muwatalli had taken advantage of Egyptian weakness early in his reign and moved his capital south from the traditional site at Hattusa, in what is now central Turkey, to Tarhuntusa, in the southeast of the Konya Plain. It was indicative of how both rulers saw Canaan, Syria, and the wider Levant as a contested region, which they needed to be near, that both Ramesses and Muwatalli moved their capitals to be closer to the Levant. In the earliest years of his reign, Ramesses conducted annual military campaigns northeast from the Nile Delta. The first of these, around 1275 BC, resulted in the pharaoh cementing his control over southern Canaan, before campaigning further north to the region around modern-day Beirut. Here he had a commemorative stele, or pylon, erected at Nar el-Kalb. The text of this has been obliterated over time, but it almost certainly proclaimed Ramesses' successes in campaigning this far north, a statement of Egypt's claims to control the region. Similarly, he engaged in further campaigns against the Amuru, a people who occupied much of what is now Syria, as vassals of King Muwatalli and the Hittites. However, whatever nominal control over this region Ramesses was able to establish in 1275 was ephemeral. No sooner had he withdrawn back to Pyramesses at the end of the campaigning season than Egyptian influence in Syria effectively collapsed, and the Hittites were able to reimpose themselves. The war between the Egyptians and the Hittites at this time has become widely renowned for a battle which it is generally accepted occurred in the year 1274 BC. This was the Battle of Kadesh, or Kadesh, near the city of Kadesh on the banks of the Orontes River in western Syria. The Battle of Kadesh was clearly a highly significant one, involving armies of a very substantial size by the standards of the Late Bronze Age, but also being regarded as a unique or significant event by the parties involved. It is, for instance, the best documented military encounter of the second millennium BC, with both sides making extensive records concerning it in years to come in the form of tablets, wall paintings, and inscriptions throughout Egypt and other parts of the Late Bronze Age world. Thus, the Battle of Kadesh was unquestionably believed by contemporaries to have been an era-defining military engagement. The background of the battle was Ramesses' new campaign into Syria in 1274 BC. As with the previous year's campaign, his goal was to extend Egyptian power further north into Syria at the expense of the Hittites. Ramesses led 4 divisions of troops into Canaan and then north towards Syria that year. These were named for some of the paramount Egyptian deities, Amun, Ra, Seth, and Ptah, and consisted of perhaps as many as 40,000 men, with 2,000 chariots also provided for the campaign. These were augmented by thousands of Canaanite mercenaries who joined the pharaoh's forces. However, not all of these forces were deployed at Kadesh, and it seems probable that Ramesses' forces did not exceed 30,000 men in total on the field of battle. Arrayed against him was Muwatalli's army of somewhere between 25,000 and 45,000 men, with several thousand chariots also brought south into Syria. Consequently, the armies of the two sides were relatively evenly matched. A striking aspect of the engagement was the number of chariots deployed, with many Egyptologists and Hittite scholars speculating since that this was the largest chariot battle in history. In its initial stages, Ramesses was caught off guard at Kadesh. He received false intelligence about the location of the main Hittite army far to the north, whereas in fact Muwatalli's armies were stationed near Old Kadesh, not far from the Egyptian advance party. As a result, when the Hittites attacked, some of Ramesses' main divisions of troops were far to the south and could not be brought into the field of battle. As a result, the Ra division was scattered by a Hittite chariot assault in the first stages of the battle near Kadesh. However, this is the point at which Ramesses' leadership is believed to have proved pivotal, as he steeled the Ammon division of his troops and counterattacked against the Hittites, breaking their chariot assault. Some accounts have it that the fault also lay with the Hittites, who, believing that their initial attack had proved conclusive, had stopped to plunder the baggage trains and goods of the Ra division, leaving them exposed to Ramesses' coordinated counterattack. Thereafter, Mu'tali ordered his troops to retreat towards the Orontes River. Later Egyptian accounts suggest that the Ptah division now arrived to Kadesh and harried the Hittites. Mu'tali ordered a new counterattack led by his chariot divisions, but this was unable to break the Egyptian advance. Eventually, the Hittites were forced to flee northwards over the river Orontes, in many cases throwing their weapons and armor aside in order to swim through the river to safety. It is unclear exactly how conclusive the alleged Egyptian victory at Kadesh was. Some Egyptologists believe that the battle was a major military victory for Ramesses. He certainly depicted it as such. For the rest of his long reign, the pharaoh consistently erected stelae and had inscriptions and wall paintings placed in temples and in his palaces, depicting Kadesh as a great victory for Egypt in Syria. These include the Kadesh inscriptions or bulletin and the poem of Pentor, a prose account of the Egyptian victory which is repeated on the walls of temples all along the course of the River Nile. The poem is extant in 8 different places, while the bulletin is to be found inscribed in 7 different locations around Egypt. Consequently, it is clearly something which Ramesses tried to establish as the official version of his alleged victory at Kadesh. But other scholars of the late Bronze Age world are more skeptical, with some arguing that Kadesh was probably more of a stalemate than a victory for either side. Certainly, it cannot have been the kind of comprehensive victory which Ramesses attempted to depict it as, for the battle did not lead to any major shift in the strategic situation in Syria. Rather, the Egyptians and the Hittites continued to contest the region for many years to come. The Battle of Kadesh did not bring the war between Egypt and the Hittite Empire to a complete conclusion, though it did signal the end of the most intense initial period of clashes between the Egyptians and the Hittites. Skirmishes continued for years thereafter. For instance, in 1269 BC, Ramesses launched a new campaign into Syria, during which he conquered the city of Dapur. However, the pattern during the 1260s was that Ramesses was able to briefly acquire control over parts of Syria while he campaigned personally there. But longer-term control over the region could not be maintained once the major Egyptian military presence was withdrawn. In recognition of this situation around 1259 BC, the Egyptians and the Hittites agreed to what is variously called either the Egyptian-Hittite Treaty or the Eternal Treaty or Silver Treaty. This was signed between Ramesses II and Hutusili III, who had succeeded as ruler of the Hittite Empire at some point in the 1260s. The Eternal Treaty effectively brokered a lasting peace, one in which the two powers agreed to cease hostilities as it was costing both governments exorbitant amounts of money and achieving little for either. Thus, Syria was to become a sphere of Hittite influence, with Egypt largely confirmed in its control of Canaan and other more southerly parts of the Levant. Bonds were agreed and pledges made, and the gods invoked as overseers of the eternal peace. The Eternal Treaty is one of the most famed international agreements made in ancient times. This is owing to the highly unusual survival of multiple copies of the text over 3 millennia later in different languages. Copies of the text of the treaty in Egyptian hieroglyphics were found inscribed in 2 separate locations in Luxor in central Egypt in the first half of the 19th century. Then, in the first years of the 20th century, the German archaeologist Hugo Winkler uncovered a copy of the text in the Akkadian language, the lingua franca of the Hittite Empire and other states of the Middle East in the 13th century BC, as part of a cache of approximately 10,000 tablets which were discovered while excavating the ancient Hittite capital at Hattusa in Turkey. Thus we have a remarkable example here of an international treaty being copied out and deposited in royal archives and temples in cities 2,000 kilometers away from each other over 3,200 years ago. As to the motives of the respective parties, it is clear that both Ramesses and Hattusili had both come to believe that peace and the fostering of trade in the Levant would be more beneficial than a continuation of their rivalry, while both states were quite likely wary of the rise of the Assyrian Empire to the east in Mesopotamia and believed a united front against this upstart power was better than ongoing warfare in Syria. The signing of the Eternal Treaty also provided a respite for Ramesses in order for him to concentrate militarily on matters to the south of Egypt. For roughly a millennium between the middle of the 3rd millennium BC down to roughly 1500 BC, the region of modern-day Sudan had been independent of Egypt. At the time it was known as Nubia and was dominated by the Kerema culture, which produced states like the Kingdom of Kush. However, during the New Kingdom period, and in particular during the reign of Thutmose III, Nubia had gradually been brought more and more under the control of Pharaonic Egypt. As with Canaan and Syria, Egyptian control declined here as a result of the unrest created by Akhenaten's rule in the 14th century BC. But Ramesses was now in a position to reverse this situation. Early in his reign, he had already campaigned south of the first cataract of the Nile. These cataracts are a series of locations along the course of the River Nile where the whitewater rapids predominate, and were used at the time as intermediary points where Egyptian arms were extended as far as was possible in campaigns against the Nubians. By the 1260s, Ramesses had effectively extended Egyptian control as far as the Second Cataract, which lies south of Abu Simbel and Wadi Halfa in what is now northern Sudan. But the period following the establishment of the Eternal Treaty with the Hittites provided a military respite which allowed Ramesses to send forces further south again to the Third Cataract. This lies well into Sudan at the northern margin of the Dongola River. Here Ramesses was able to establish a southern military colony at Tombos, as evidenced by the discovery of pharaonic and royal inscriptions here in tombs built at the height of the New Kingdom in the 13th century BC. Thus, by the 1240s BC, Ramesses had effectively brought a significant amount of Nubia under outright Egyptian control. Ramesses was soon campaigning westwards as well. Our knowledge of Libya in ancient times is surprisingly limited for a region which was in close proximity to major centers of civilization such as Egypt and Crete. Generally speaking, the main settlement points here were a series of ports and oases along the north coast or slightly inland, but proximate to the Mediterranean Sea. The land here was known as Gehennu to the Egyptians. Libya is a name derived from later Greek descriptions of the region. Despite the lack of historical knowledge about the society that existed here in ancient times, there was significant contact between the Egyptians and Libya throughout the New Kingdom period, mostly in the form of Berber raids into the western branches of the Nile Delta and Egyptian efforts to establish coastal colonies along the north of Libya. Ramesses attempted to further this effort by establishing new forts along the Mediterranean coastline and reinforcing a fort at Zawiat el-Rakam, which his father, Seti I, had established earlier after campaigning against the Libyan tribes of the region. In the course of Ramesses' reign, this became the major western extremity of the Egyptian kingdom, though trade centers and vassal states were to be found further to the west in Libya proper. These accomplishments, as with nearly everything else to do with Ramesses' military endeavors, were recorded in a series of stelae and other monumental inscriptions in southern and central Egypt later in his reign. With these campaigns in Nubia and Libya, and the earlier endeavors in Canaan and Syria, by the middle of his reign, Ramesses had succeeded in extending the Egyptian kingdom to the greatest point it had been at since the days of Thutmose III 2 centuries earlier. Beyond the pharaoh's core control of Egypt, his forces had moved south along the River Nile, effectively repossessing Nubia after it had broadly regained its independence during the period of instability under Akhenaten in the 14th century BC. Elsewhere, Ramesses had campaigned westwards into the deserts of the Sahara and along the north coast to bring Libya into a partial vassalage. However, it was his conquests to the northeast that were most substantial. Here, Ramesses had captured Canaan and much of Syria. It wasn't simply that this was one of the richest parts of the world at the time, with affluent trading cities like Tyre and Sidon, but in order to achieve some hegemony here, Ramesses had to defeat one of the most substantial powers of the ancient world, the Hittite Empire. In doing so, he carved out one of the largest territorial empires ever seen up to that time. Thus, in the late Bronze Age, Ramesses had arguably transformed New Kingdom Egypt into the most powerful state in the known world, a major achievement after the period of instability that had characterized Egypt as recently as the 14th century. Throughout his military campaigns of the 1270s, 1260s and 1250s, Ramesses was accompanied by an ever-growing number of his sons. This is unsurprising when we consider that Ramesses is believed to have had approximately 100 children, of which a roughly equal amount were sons and daughters. Such a large brood was a byproduct of the practice of polygamy by ancient Egyptian pharaohs. Ramesses had many wives, the details of several of which are well known. For instance, his primary consort was Nefertari, the first of Ramesses' great royal wives. Her background is not precisely known, but some have speculated that she was descended from Pharaoh I, who had ruled Egypt 4 decades prior to Ramesses' succession as part of the 18th dynasty. She and Ramesses evidently married quite young, as she became queen consort as soon as he ascended to the throne around 1279 BC. They had many children together, and on the strength of the numerous temples and shrines which Ramesses had built in her honor, there is no doubting that she was the most revered of his wives. She is also somewhat unique as a queen consort of the New Kingdom period, for whom we have extant correspondence. Nefertari wrote on multiple occasions to King Hattusili III, ruler of the Hittite Empire, and his wife Pudu-Hepa in the 1260s and 1250s, and tablets of this correspondence have been unearthed in the Hittite capital Hattusa. Nefertari died around 1255, and since Ramesses lived for many decades to come, new great wives emerged in the years that followed. Paramount amongst these was Isetnofret. She too seems to have married Ramesses before his accession as pharaoh, but she was clearly a junior consort while Nefertari lived. Her seniority from the mid-1250s is attested to by numerous inscriptions and records of her which appear on statues and temple walls across Egypt. Other great wives of the pharaoh emerged from political arrangements. For instance, as part of the Eternal Treaty of 1259 BC with the Hittites, Ramesses took one of the daughters of King Hattusili III and Queen Pudu-Hepa as his wife, although the marriage to Matonaforere was not solemnized until the mid-1240s BC, presumably as the Hittite king's daughter was considered to be too young for the marriage to be formalized in the early 1250s BC. Curiously enough, some of Ramesses' other great royal wives included some of his daughters. Bint Anat, for instance, was born from Ramesses' marriage to Isetnofret, before later marrying her own father. Such familial relationships were common throughout the history of pharaonic Egypt and resulted in significant complications of inbreeding, the most famous example of which had been Tutankhamun 50 years before Ramesses' reign. Tutankhamun suffered from multiple physical ailments, the exact nature of which are still debated, but which Egyptologists concur were most likely owing to the species of inbreeding that characterized Ramesses II's own familial life in the 13th century BC. This extensive royal family was intimately connected throughout Ramesses' long reign with the cult of Ra, the sun god, and one of the paramount deities in the Egyptian religious system, who was also worshipped as Amun-Ra in a slightly different form. Ra, along with others such as Ptah and Horus, were the paramount deities of the New Kingdom, and as we will see shortly, Ramesses' extensive building program across Egypt from the 1260s onwards made continuous efforts to associate the pharaoh with the cult of these particular deities. From the early 1240s BC onwards, once Ramesses had reigned over 30 years, he was also able to become the center of his own species of religious cult in the shape of the Sed festival or Feast of the Tail. This was a religious festival which was held annually to celebrate the reign of any pharaoh who had ruled for over 30 years. It was nominally held in honor of the wolf god, Sed or Wepwawet. The origins of the festival are somewhat macabre. It may have been the case that the Sed festival was originally held as a ritual in which a long-lived pharaoh was ritually murdered, the idea being that once he reached a certain age, it was time for him to be removed from power. Over time, the festival changed to one in which the king was honored rather than killed. Under Ramesses, the Sed festival was celebrated at the traditional capital, Thebes, for the first time in 1249 BC. Thereafter, it was held every 3 years for as long as Ramesses lived. Such was the length of his reign that he went on to celebrate an unprecedented number of Sed festivals. If the first half of Ramesses' reign was primarily dominated by warfare and the extension of the realm's borders, the second half of it was remarkable for the extensive building projects which were undertaken by the pharaoh. Ancient Egypt is synonymous with brilliant architectural achievement, but this was achieved at irregular intervals. For instance, the first intermediate period of Egyptian history, which occurred in the late 3rd millennium BC, prior to the advent of the subsequent Middle Kingdom, was a period of lackluster building projects. Conversely, the New Kingdom period, which had begun in the 16th century BC, saw a new age of major building projects commissioned by the pharaohs along the River Nile. Ramesses II was the greatest proponent of this new age of pharaonic patronage of religious and mortuary architecture. In fact, his reign witnessed the most significant building program seen since the days of pharaohs such as Cheops, who in the 26th century BC constructed the pyramid complex at Giza near modern-day Cairo, including the Great Pyramids, the only surviving wonder of the ancient world. However, by the New Kingdom period, such monumental buildings as were constructed by Ramesses focused more on erecting great temples, obelisks, and statues to honor the pharaoh and the gods, rather than on giant pyramids to act as mortuary tombs. One of the most significant building projects undertaken by Ramesses was at Thebes or Luxor in central Egypt, the traditional capital of New Kingdom Egypt. Here Ramesses had the Ramesseum built on the Theban necropolis, an elevated region on the west bank of the River Nile in the city where many other pharaohs had erected mortuary and religious buildings over the centuries. The Ramesseum took roughly 20 years to complete and is effectively a temple with several courtyards surrounding it. Large stone pylons and gateways lead from courtyard to courtyard, with a gigantic statue of Ramesses towering over the inner court. The temple itself consisted of 3 rooms with columns and terrace-style cells dividing up the sanctuary. Throughout them stand many statues of the Egyptian gods and goddesses, while several colossal statues of Ramesses once adorned the temple. Unfortunately, several of these were removed from Thebes in the 19th century and are now found in places in Europe such as the British Museum. On what remains, reliefs commemorate Ramesses' victory at Kadesh and other accomplishments both inside and outside the temple. What is particularly interesting about the Ramesseum is that there is evidence that a scribal school was also established here, while a small royal palace stood next to the courtyard, indicating that this was a site with several other uses beyond its religious functions. It clearly served as a center of pharaonic government in Thebes when Ramesses based himself out of the traditional New Kingdom capital. Ramesses also ordered some construction work at Saqqara. This is a site not far from the Great Pyramids of Giza, and where the first major pyramid ever built in ancient Egypt, that of Pharaoh Djoser of the 3rd dynasty, was built in the 27th century BC. And Saqqara remained a major center of monumental building work over the centuries. Ramesses decided to make his own contributions to the complexes here, in association with one of his eldest sons, Prince Kha-Emweset. For instance, the pair had the Pyramid of Unas, a pharaoh of the 5th dynasty who had lived in the 24th century BC, repaired and added an inscription to the southern facade of the edifice to indicate that they had overseen this restoration work. Ramesses and his son also enlarged the Temple of Serapis or Serapeum at Saqqara, a major center of the cult of Apis, the bull god of Egyptian mythology, who is believed to be the physical manifestation of Ptah, the Egyptian god of crafts, merchants, and the dead. Recent archaeological discoveries at Saqqara have also unearthed the tomb of Ptah Mwea, who served for a time as Grand Vizier and treasurer in the government of Ramesses II. His was not the only tomb built at Saqqara for senior government officials of Ramesses' reign, and the site at Saqqara highlights the esteem such bureaucrats were held in at the height of the new kingdom in ancient Egypt. One of the most significant aspects of Ramesses' building program was the manner in which he used grand temples and buildings as a way of expressing the extension of Egyptian power into regions which had largely become independent of pharaonic rule in the 14th century BC. This was particularly the case to the south towards Nubia, along the course of the River Nile. Ramesses had many temples constructed here on the way to what is now Sudan, as an expression of the rejuvenation of Egyptian rule here. One of the most impressive was the Temple of Beit al-Wali, which was built on an island in the middle of the River Nile, just a few kilometers from Aswan in southern Egypt. This was dedicated to some of the foremost Egyptian deities of the New Kingdom period, Amun-Ra, Re-Horakti, Khnum, and Anuket. It is notable for having some of the best preserved and most impressive wall painting reliefs from ancient Egypt, many of which depict Ramesses' campaigns into Nubia and his subjugation of the region. His campaigns into Syria and Libya are also depicted. Over 100 kilometers to the south, on the west bank of the River Nile, Ramesses had the two temples of Wadi es-Sabur also constructed, renovating one earlier temple in the process. The site here was used as a stop-off point for boats traversing the Nile to and from Nubia. Ramesses thus had the temples constructed in a location where many people visited and dedicated them both to himself and Amun-Ra. Perhaps the most striking architectural feature here are rows of sphinxes which depicted Ramesses as individuals entered and left the temples. Perhaps the greatest building project undertaken by Ramesses, though, lay far to the south of Luxor near what is now the border between Egypt and Sudan, at the Second Nile Cataract. This was the temple complex near what was then known as Ipsambul, but which we know today as Abu Simbel. Here Ramesses had initiated the construction of two temples back in the mid-1260s. They would take 20 years to complete, but eventually resulted in two large temples carved in a sheer rock face near the village. One of these was dedicated to Ramesses himself, and the smaller one was in honor of the pharaoh's primary consort, Queen Nefertari. When it was completed in 1244 BC, the great temple was inscribed as having been built as, quote, the Temple of Ramesses, beloved of Amun. It consisted of a grand entrance which led into a temple dedicated to several of the major Egyptian deities. Sculptures and reliefs adorned the interior. It is also believed that the temple was built in such a way that the chamber flooded with sunlight on the 22nd of October and the 22nd of February every year, illuminating the statues here. It is speculated that these dates are significant as possibly being the dates of Ramesses' birth and coronation as pharaoh. Moreover, the reliefs and sculptures are celebratory of Ramesses' reign, with his military campaigns and his victories depicted on the walls, notably the Battle of Kadesh. While the interior of the Temple of Abu Simbel is impressive, the most notable aspect of the temple complex is the series of colossal statues which were erected on either side of the main entrance outside the temple. At the Grand Temple, there are 4 such colossal statues, 2 to either side of the entrance. All four of these depict Ramesses and stand approximately 20 meters tall, making them some of the largest pharaonic statues ever carved during the 3 millennia of ancient Egyptian history. It is difficult to get a precise idea of how vast these statues are from looking at photographs, but if one stands next to them, an individual only reaches up to the pharaoh's feet, with the remainder of the statues towering well above. On each statue, Ramesses was depicted wearing the dual crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt. A statement here in the border region between Egypt and Nubia that the pharaoh was lord of the land of the river Nile, both to the south and the north. Thus, the temple of Abu Simbel was meant as a statement of Ramesses' power and rule over Egypt, a proclamation of sorts to those south of Abu Simbel that the pharaohs reigned here yet again. Abu Simbel is the pinnacle of Ramesses' building program. Ramesses' reign is notable for its length. Having most likely succeeded his father in 1279 BC, he is believed to have ruled for over 65 years. However, what is somewhat unusual about this long reign is how unremarkable the second half of it was, and in particular, the last 2 decades or so of Ramesses' reign. All of the notable events of his time as pharaoh, from the Battle of Kadesh to the Eternal Treaty and the campaigns west to Libya and south into Nubia, all occurred in the first 20 or so years of his rule. Even the monumental building programs which he undertook at Abu Simbel, Thebes and elsewhere, although many of them took upwards of 20 years to complete, were generally finished by the early 1230s BC. By way of comparison, the last 20 or so years of Ramesses II's reign are something of a mystery. There is little evidence of major events or what he may have been doing. This is quite possibly because the pharaoh spent many years ill towards the end of his life, and with his health declining. Scientific analysis of his mummy in recent times has revealed that Ramesses suffered from a range of ailments in old age, including arthritis, atherosclerosis, and severe dental issues, but he survived for an immense amount of time despite these illnesses. Such evidence as we have indicates Ramesses II did not die until 1213 BC in the 66th year of his reign, probably aged around 90, an extraordinarily long life by the standards of the time. He was originally interred in the Valley of the Kings, where many pharaohs were interred in the hills outside Thebes, but owing to looting of the graves here, his body was moved on several occasions. Like all the ancient pharaohs, he was mummified, meaning that his body was partially preserved across the centuries. Ramesses was succeeded by his son Merneptah, who took the regnal name Ba-en-re-Meri-Netjeru, which means the soul of Ra, beloved of the gods. This Merneptah is believed to have been the 13th son of Ramesses, a development which should have placed him well down the pecking order of possible successors to his father. However, Ramesses had lived for so long that a huge number of his older sons had died. Indeed, Merneptah was probably well into his 60s by the time of his own accession, and his reign would only last 10 years. The most significant development during his reign was a victory which he won over the tribes of Libya at the Battle of Perire in 1208 BC. Thereafter, there was a quick succession of pharaohs before the 19th dynasty came to an end, with the dying out of Ramesses' direct line of descent in 1189 BC. Thus, the dynasty lasted for just over a century and was completely dominated by the reign of Ramesses II. However, in recognition of the extraordinary reign of Ramesses the Great, many pharaohs of the 20th dynasty adopted his regnal name. In all, there were eventually 11 Ramesses, the last being Ramesses XI of the 20th dynasty, who died around 1077 BC. In death, Ramesses II has acquired an even greater historical fame over the years, as it has been regularly speculated that he is the pharaoh of the story of the Book of Exodus in the Old Testament. This is one of the earliest sections of the Old Testament, and is central to both Judaism and Christianity. In it, the story of the Jews, who are effectively living as slaves in what is termed the land of Goshen, but which is Pharaonic Egypt, is related. This picks up from the book of Genesis, which had related how Joseph, the son of the Hebrew prophet Jacob, had been tricked by his brothers and sold into slavery in Egypt. Over the next several generations, a large community of Jewish slaves came to live in Egypt under the subjugation of the Egyptian pharaohs. In Exodus, we read the story of how the Jewish prophet Moses is placed in a reed basket and sent down the river Nile by his mother Jochebed, after the Pharaoh had ordered the murder of Jewish children, following concern about the number of Jews or Israelites that were then present in Egypt. Moses is subsequently found and adopted into the Pharaoh's household, where he gains the affection of the Egyptian king. But Moses clashes with the Pharaoh's biological son. Eventually, he realizes he is one of the Israelites and leads his people out of Egypt by parting the Red Sea as the Pharaoh's forces attempt to chase him. The debate on Ramesses is whether he could be identified as being either the ruling pharaoh of the book of Exodus or his biological son who becomes Moses' rival. There is really no substantive case, however, in either instance for speculating to this effect. The book of Exodus makes no effort to identify the historical figures who might have been involved in pharaonic Egypt at the time, and the historicity of the events of the Old Testament are, of course, open to speculation as well. Consequently, different writers have speculated that a wide range of pharaohs dating from as early as the 17th century BC and as late as the 12th century BC may be the pharaoh of the book of Exodus or his biological son. An unusually high proportion of people have been anxious to suggest it was Ramesses II who was the pharaoh at the time, with this line being favored in more than one prominent Hollywood treatment of Moses' life, notably the Ten Commandments of 1956, in which Ramesses was depicted by Yul Brynner. These depictions are largely due to Ramesses being the most prominent pharaoh of this age. His reign was lengthy, and he was involved in military conquests in the Levant, which would fit with oppression of the Israelites. These things aside, though, there is no historical basis for suggesting that Ramesses II is the pharaoh of the book of Exodus. Indeed, that Ramesses should be identified with the biblical pharaoh of Exodus is perhaps fitting. After all, much of the tale of Moses portends doom for Egypt for impeding the destiny of the Israelites to return to their ancestral homeland and establish a new kingdom there. And there is no doubting that New Kingdom Egypt quickly headed towards a period of immense decline shortly after Ramesses' reign. Beginning around 1200 BC, the eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, and adjoining areas were struck by a series of attacks by a mysterious confederation of warlike people who have typically been identified as the Sea Peoples. There is no consensus even today as to who these people were or where they had come from, although it has plausibly been speculated that they came eastwards from the western Mediterranean, possibly from Italy and parts of southern France or the northwestern Balkans. Wherever they came from, what we do know is that the onslaught of these newcomers, along with the arrival of other warlike peoples such as the Dorians who came from northern Greece around this time, was an immediate threat to the late Bronze Age world and began to destabilize societies such as those of New Kingdom Egypt in the decades that followed. What followed is typically referred to as the Late Bronze Age collapse in the historiography of the ancient world, as the powerful states which had dominated the region for several centuries either declined dramatically or collapsed. The Hittite Empire splintered into several smaller states during the course of the 12th century BC, while Bronze Age Mycenae and the Minoan civilization of Crete were almost entirely destroyed. New Kingdom Egypt also entered a period of pronounced decline, though it survived as a substantial polity, albeit much weakened internally, divided by civil wars and reduced in terms of its territorial expanse. This reflected much of what occurred elsewhere. Trade collapsed across the Bronze Age world for the space of 2 centuries or more, and the economy was so impacted that whole cities were abandoned, and famines struck many regions, such that many historians of the ancient past refer to this as being a dark age of the ancient world, similar to what followed the collapse of the Roman Empire nearly 2 millennia later. What is known as the Third Intermediate Period of Egyptian history followed the end of the New Kingdom, as new regional powers began to dominate what remained of pharaonic Egypt, some of them hailing from Nubia in the south. Ramesses II's tomb was discovered during the late 19th century. This was a time when Egyptology, the study of pharaonic Egypt, was entering its first golden age following the deciphering of Egyptian hieroglyphics using the Rosetta Stone. The great pharaoh's tomb was discovered at Deir al-Bahari in 1881 near Thebes, within a wider cache of royal tombs dating to the New Kingdom period. Ramesses' tomb, like nearly all other pharaohs, had been looted at some stage in the past and revealed nothing to rival the riches of that of Tutankhamun, which would be discovered 40 years later by Howard Carter. However, Ramesses' tomb is nevertheless significant, particularly a series of inscriptions on the sarcophagus which listed Ramesses' various names and titles and also provided an inventory of his burial goods. The inscriptions also indicate that Ramesses was not immediately interred at Deir al-Bahari, but rather he was first laid to rest in the tomb of his father, Seti I. It remained there for the next 80 years, until such time in the mid-12th century that his tomb was relocated. What is especially strange about all of this is that Egyptologists now believe that the wooden and painted death mask and sarcophagus used in Ramesses' new tomb were actually recycled from the tomb of one of his near successors, Horemheb, the last ruler of the 18th dynasty. It is also evident that renovations were carried out on Ramesses' tomb in subsequent years, indicating that the ancient Egyptians did not simply seal the tombs of dead pharaohs for all time when they were laid to rest, but viewed some of these tombs as shrines which were to be maintained and improved where possible. Unsurprisingly, given the extent of the building program he oversaw, Ramesses II has continued to feature regularly in studies of ancient Egypt and new archaeological projects. Indeed, in the case of Abu Simbel, his temple here was central to one of the most extraordinary relocation projects ever undertaken. In the 1950s, the new government of General Abdel Nasser, who had seized power in Egypt following the Egyptian Revolution of 1952, determined to build a vast new dam at Aswan in order to henceforth control the annual flooding or inundation of the River Nile, on which so much of the country's agriculture depended. The resulting flooding and the creation of what was to be named Lake Nasser near the dam would have submerged Abu Simbel. Accordingly, in 1959, the Egyptian government applied to UNESCO to move the temple. This petition was granted, and over the next several years, several Swedish engineering firms undertook the project for the Egyptian government. The work involved was highly complex, as Abu Simbel was not constructed out of blocks of stone, but was carved into a cliff face. Thus, the temple was rescued by effectively making a giant incision into the mountainside and then transplanting the temple piece by piece to a site several hundred meters inland and much higher above ground. Thus, Abu Simbel now overlooks the River Nile, much as it has for over 3 millennia, but from a different vantage point and site. Owing to the length of his reign and its significance, Ramesses has also featured extensively in modern popular culture. For instance, Norman Mailer's Ancient Evenings, published in 1983 by the American author, was an enormous fictional account of pharaonic Egypt set on one evening in the late 12th century BC, but in which the characters repeatedly discuss the reign of Ramesses II. The Battle of Kadesh is a major feature of the work. Ramesses was also the subject of works by the noted historical fiction writer Christian Jack, while he is the central character too of Anne Rice's The Mummy. So too does he appear in many numerous Hollywood treatments of ancient Egypt. But surely the most notable popular cultural reference to the victor of the Battle of Kadesh appeared 2 centuries ago in the Romantic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley's poem Ozymandias, the Greek name for Ramesses. Here Shelley used Ramesses as an example of how all great rulers are destined for decline or death. It was meant to be a reflection by Shelley primarily on Napoleon Bonaparte, who had fallen from power in France and Europe just a few years before Shelley's time of writing. But Shelley used Ramesses as his analogy, as news was circulating around London at the time that the British Museum had just acquired one of the colossal heads of the pharaoh from the Ramesseum. Shelley's repetition of the inscription which once adorned the tomb, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair," must rank as amongst some of the most famous lines of 19th century poetry. Ramesses II, or Ramesses the Great, was arguably the greatest of all ancient Egypt's pharaohs, of which there were over 170 across 3 millennia. His reign is notable for many things. From a political and military perspective, he extended the Egyptian kingdom to the greatest point it had seen since the reign of Thutmose III 2 centuries earlier, the point at which Egypt reached its greatest extremity by conquering much of the Levant, Syria, and parts of Mesopotamia. Ramesses did this primarily by defeating the Hittites in his nation's ongoing struggle with them for hegemony over the rich coastal cities of Canaan and Syria such as Tyre and Sidon. The peak of his success in this respect was victory at the Battle of Kadesh and the Eternal Treaty of 1259 BC. But it was not just here where Ramesses was militarily successful. He also campaigned against the Sherdan Sea pirates early on in his reign, which had been plaguing the northern coast of Egypt for many years prior to his accession, and later campaigned westwards along the Mediterranean coast towards Libya. Finally, to the south, he extended the Egyptian kingdom's influence much further down the course of the River Nile into what is now Sudan, but which was then known as Nubia. This new kingdom empire of Ramesses II was one of the most formidable empires of ancient times. However, there is also the distinct possibility that Ramesses has been accorded the prominence which he has in studies of ancient Egypt and amongst Egyptologists owing to his own self-promotion. Ramesses was one of history's first great propagandists. There was no success which he achieved on the battlefield or aspect of his reign that he did not commemorate in stone in such a way as it would be remembered for centuries or even millennia to come. Thus, for instance, we find him setting stone stelae and other markers in the Nile Delta and the Levant to proclaim his victories over the Hittites and the Sherdan Sea pirates there to the world and to future generations. But it was his building program in places like Luxor, Saqqara, and above all Abu Simbel, way down the Nile near Aswan, which afforded him his greatest legacy. Here in stone he proclaimed to all his magnificence as a ruler, his ties to the sun god Ra, and his many military accomplishments. Yet while these building works may have been acts of propaganda, there is no denying their brilliance. Accordingly, from the perspective of the 21st century, surely Ramesses' greatest accomplishment was in having these magnificent temples, statues, and obelisks erected across Egypt nearly 3,500 years ago. What do you think of Ramesses the Great? Was he ancient Egypt's greatest pharaoh? Or is the greatness of his legacy partly due to a shrewd policy of propaganda concerning his building projects, as well as his promotion of his own military victories? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
The man known to history as Pharaoh Akhenaten was born at some unknown date and year, though almost certainly in the 1360s BC. He was certainly alive in 1361 BC, but most likely many years prior to this, with 1368 BC or 1367 BC being plausible candidates for the year of his birth. His father was the pharaoh or king of Egypt, Amenhotep III. Akhenaten was named after his father when he was born, and while he is known to history as Akhenaten, for much of his life he was called Amenhotep. Akhenaten, as we will see, was a name he took himself later in his life. Amenhotep III had been on the throne for around 2 decades by the time Akhenaten was born. having come to be pharaoh in the early 1380s BC. It is not known where Akhenaten was born. Some Egyptologists have speculated that he may have been born and raised in the ancient city of Memphis near Heliopolis, a city which had a strong cult of worshipping the sun god Ra. Others contend that he was born around the city of Thebes, the more southerly capital of the Egyptian kingdom in the 14th century BC, approximate to modern-day Luxor. There, a major royal palace had been constructed at Malkata by his father, and it would probably make most sense for him to have been born there. Akhenaten's mother was Tia, the great wife of Amenhotep. Egyptian rulers practiced polygamy and had numerous wives, some often being close relatives or even sisters. Amongst these multiple consorts there was typically a great wife, and the pharaoh's successor would normally be chosen from amongst the sons born to this chief consort. This placed Akhenaten in line to the throne, but he had an older brother who was also born to Tia, Prince Thutmose. Beyond these, Akhenaten had a very large number of siblings and half-siblings, owing to the polygamous nature of the royal court. The boy that would become Akhenaten one day was born into a part of the world which already had a very long history by the 14th century BC. Egypt had emerged as far back as the 4th millennium BC as one of the first major centers of Neolithic and Chalcolithic settled civilizations as people began farming in great numbers along the shores of the River Nile. In ancient times, and indeed prior to the building of the Aswan Dam in the 20th century, the Nile flooded every year. This annual inundation deposited rich alluvial soil onto the banks of the river several hundred meters inland, allowing people here to survive out of the agricultural products grown on these floodplains in an otherwise arid desert environment. Based on this, an advanced culture with a writing system, industry, and other economic elements emerged, and by the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, the pharaohs or kings of the Old Kingdom were in a position to deploy resources capable of building the Great Pyramid on the Giza Plateau, next to modern-day Cairo. Unsurprisingly, a complex religious system also developed, one which lionized deities like Osiris, the god of the River Nile, on which the people were so reliant for their subsistence, and Ra, the sun god, who was so central to the lives of people who otherwise lived in the midst of the Sahara Desert. This pharaonic society had peaked early in the middle of the 3rd millennium BC as the rulers of what is termed the Old Kingdom built the greatest of the pyramids. Thereafter, it went through peaks and valleys. For instance, the 22nd and 21st centuries BC were turbulent ones of unrest in Egypt, but thereafter the Middle Kingdom was a new period of growth. A fresh bout of chaos came in the 17th century BC, when a people called the Hyksos descended from the Levant into northern Egypt, conquered the Nile Delta and much of the north of the country from the Egyptian kings. For a period of a century and a half, Egypt was divided and harassed by the Hyksos. Yet they too were conquered over time, and in the 15th century BC, Akhenaten's great-great-grandfather, Thutmose III, had overseen Egypt's rise to a position of unprecedented national power and wealth. Ruling for over half a century, he reunified Egypt fully, extended its power further down the Nile into what we now call Sudan, and also conquered much of the Levant into regions approximating today with Palestine, Israel, and even towards Jordan and into parts of Syria and Lebanon. Trade flourished across the eastern Mediterranean, and an ambitious building program was initiated. This period of immense Egyptian power, which Thutmose was the greatest ruler of, is called the New Kingdom period of Egyptian history. Akhenaten would benefit from succeeding to the throne as Egypt was in such a propitious position of power, but his reign would also stand as a period of turmoil within it. As the shadowy details of his birth would indicate, there is almost nothing known about Akhenaten's early life, but such is the interest in the reign of one of the most unusual and significant of ancient Egypt's rulers that many theories have emerged over the years. One holds that he was raised to a significant extent away from the royal capital at Memphis in the north, near where Cairo stands today. Here it is posited that he was a high priest of the god Ptah, the god of workers and industry in the Egyptian religious system. We know that his older brother, Prince Thutmose, served as high priest of Ptah as well for several years before he headed south to begin training as his father's successor at Thebes. The suggestion is that Akhenaten succeeded him in that role afterwards, and it may have been this time in his youth as a high priest that imbued Akhenaten with strong religious sensibilities. Other theories concern his education, with several well-known scribes of the time being suggested as possible tutors of the prince. We can be certain that one of these, a man named Parennefer, did indeed tutor young Akhenaten in his childhood years, as this Parennefer was later honored with a major tomb where an inscription notes his role in educating the pharaoh. Parennefer would also go on to become the senior-most minister in Akhenaten's government in later years, and seems to have been a major influence on Akhenaten's life and reign. Some greater clarity is possible when it comes to Akhenaten's wives and children. Though there is still a lot that remains speculative even in this area, one thing is for sure: his great wife or chief wife was a woman by the name of Nefertiti. They were married at some stage in the 1350s, and so she and he were most likely wed when they were little more than teenagers. They may have been closely related, with some Egyptologists claiming that she was a first cousin of Akhenaten's or some other near relation within the Egyptian royal line. She was quite possibly a few years older than him. Nefertiti is one of the most famous royal women in the entirety of Egyptian history. This is based on multiple developments, the first being her position as chief wife to Akhenaten, who would become one of the most notorious of all ancient Egypt's pharaohs. Secondly, she is famous for a remarkable bust or statue of her head and neck that has survived over 3 millennia. This painted limestone bust was created around 1345 BC by a famous royal sculptor of the time by the name of Thutmose. Discovered in 1912 during archaeological work at the city of Amarna, it presents one of the most vivid portraits of any Bronze Age woman to have come down to us. Finally, Nefertiti is well known for most likely being the mother of Tutankhamun, a pharaoh whose gold death mask, discovered by Howard Carter back in 1922, has become a defining symbol of ancient Egypt. Beyond this, she is also a good example of a royal consort who appears to have held a position of extensive political power in New Kingdom Egypt. Akhenaten had several other wives beyond Nefertiti. One was Kia, a name which is believed to have been a shortened version of Tadukipa. If so, she most likely was a princess of the Mitanni royal family, a people who ruled an area around Kurdistan today, where the borders of Turkey, Syria, and Iraq meet. Accordingly, her marriage to Akhenaten would have been political to cement diplomatic relations between Egypt and a near neighbor. Other scholars of Akhenaten's reign argue that Kia and Tadukipa were two different wives. Kia was nevertheless most likely of foreign blood, as she is described in some inscriptions as being Akhenaten's favorite wife, one who evidently could not rise to the position of great wife, as she, unlike Nefertiti, was not of Egyptian blood. Akhenaten also possibly married a daughter of the ruler of Babylon in Mesopotamia, though her name is unknown, while there is speculation that he was married to an unidentified sister of his. From amongst these marriages, Akhenaten had many children. His marriage to Nefertiti resulted in 7 or more children, most of them daughters. There were numerous other children from his other unions, though the exact details of these cannot be reconstructed from the available evidence, and there would doubtlessly have been some who died in infancy as well, for which no record of their existence has survived. Akhenaten's earlier years were lived in the knowledge that his older brother, Prince Thutmose, was their father's designated successor, and so he would succeed as pharaoh upon Amenhotep III's death. But Thutmose died sometime in the early to mid-1350s. With this, Akhenaten became the new heir, and so from the mid-1350s, by which time he was most likely only just entering his teenage years, he began to co-rule with his father, an arrangement which was usually established to train in a successor in the key elements of government and the religious obligations of the pharaoh. There would also have been a growing awareness of the fact that Amenhotep perhaps did not have long left to live. Statues and other visible depictions of the pharaoh dating to the 1350s depict a ruler who looks to have been aged and sick, while DNA evidence from his mummy indicates he may have been suffering from obesity and arthritis, though he was still only in his 40s. Incidentally, contrary to some popular views that the Egyptians had very effective forms of dental care, Amenhotep was also suffering by the time Akhenaten became co-ruler from teeth that were plagued with cavities and which would have caused him serious pain. It was this obese, arthritic and pain-ridden figure who managed to rule down to around 1351 BC, though perhaps as late as 1349 BC. Upon his death, Akhenaten ascended as pharaoh in his own right, initially with the regal name Amenhotep IV, though he would soon change it to Akhenaten. The first years of Akhenaten's personal rule were distinct from what followed. The 4 or 5 years in question, down to 1346 BC, have been termed the Karnak years by some Egyptologists, to indicate that he was still continuing to rule in a regular fashion from the seat of government near the temple of Karnak in the capital at Thebes, on the course of the river Nile in central Egypt. He was most likely crowned here, though possibly at Memphis, the ancient capital of the Old Kingdom. There are also inscriptions and other documentary and material evidence from the early 1340s which point towards Akhenaten continuing to worship multiple ancient Egyptian gods such as Ra, Amun, Ptah, Hathor and Nekhbet, while textual inscriptions also refer to the gods in plural. He also continued to develop the city of Thebes, a metropolis which was at the heart of a rich and energetic kingdom. The Late Bronze Age was a period of immense vitality and wealth of a kind, which would not be seen again until the Greek culture of the 6th and 5th centuries BC. Thebes was at the very heart of this, a bustling city where industries like stone cutting, painting, glass making, pottery making, and other crafts, as well as professional schools for scribes, medics, and other skilled workers flourished. Furthermore, with a possible population of between 80 and 100,000 people, there is a chance Thebes was the largest city in the world at that time. Life here in the first few years of Akhenaten's reign would have appeared perfectly normal. Few could have predicted what a strange turn things were about to take. Another feature of these Karnak years was Akhenaten's completion of some of the building projects which his father had initiated during his long reign of some 4 decades. This focused on the mortuary site which Amenhotep had developed at Kom el Hetan, across the Nile River from the city of Thebes. The majority of the mortuary temple here has been destroyed over the centuries, but the layout of it can be reconstructed. It would have consisted of rows of pylons, indoor sanctums, and outdoor sun courts, so that there was an interplay of light and dark along the walkways. This was a standard practice of ancient Egyptian religious buildings, and if rituals were held here at specific times of the day, the shafts of light penetrating through specific parts of the building would have made a deep impression on participants in rituals here, particularly where gold objects were used to refract the sun's rays in different ways. It all points to the way the sun was already central to the Egyptian religious system, and provides a backdrop to the religious changes Akhenaten was about to undertake. Elsewhere in the building, 2 gigantic statues were erected. Known today as the Colossi of Memnon, these 60-foot-high stone monuments loomed over the western bank of the River Nile, and could not have failed to impress people voyaging up and down the river on boats. The building work on the temple and the carving of the Colossi was also completed around 1350 BC, most likely just after Akhenaten had become pharaoh in his own right, and he would have overseen the rituals which no doubt accompanied the solemnizing of the new temple structure. The first years of Akhenaten's reign were normative in other respects. He continued to add to the great temple within the city precinct on the right bank of the Nile in Thebes. Here there is even an inscription depicting the new pharaoh making offerings to the god Ra. though elsewhere there was a subtle profusion of shrines and other religious spaces dedicated to the sun god Aten in the early 1340s. Elsewhere in Thebes, Akhenaten oversaw a Sed festival in the second or third year of his reign. This was in itself a rather peculiar move on his part. Sed festivals were the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a royal jubilee. They were typically only held after 20 or 30 years of the same pharaoh being ruler of the kingdom, and then every 3 or 4 years thereafter. In calling one within a few years of his accession, Akhenaten was indicating his willingness to break with tradition. His motive in doing so may have been a desire to establish continuity between his own reign and that of his father, and it is noted that the date of it may have fallen around the 40th anniversary of Amenhotep III's accession. If this is so, perhaps Akhenaten felt some vulnerability about having been a younger son and only emerging as the heir and then pharaoh in the course of the 1350s. The Sed festival may have been organized in an effort to proclaim the legitimacy of his reign and cement his status as the new pharaoh. While there were normative elements to Akhenaten's reign during its first years, it would soon take a dramatic turn that has created an infamous position for the pharaoh within the history of ancient Egypt. The shift came in 1346 BC, though for how long Akhenaten had been considering this new course or why he decided upon it at this time remains a mystery, with no clear answer. This all centered on the deity Aten, also spelt Atun, Atonu, or Eton in various other references to him on temple inscriptions. The word itself derives from Old Kingdom Egyptian and refers effectively to a disk or sun disk. Therefore, in its earliest incarnation, the name Aten was used simply as a noun to refer to the spherical or disk-like appearance of the sun when viewed in the sky. Over time, the term Aten became one which was used to refer to a sun deity or god. Aten was just one such sun god. The most popular and important of these was Ra, one of the most important of all the Egyptian gods and goddesses, one who is said to travel through the sky in an ark every day, bringing light to the world. While in the evening he retired and night fell. Aten was just one of over a dozen deities which emerged around the worship of the sun, day and night in Egypt over the centuries. These practices of multiple forms of sun deity were reflected in a great many other ancient cultures of the Chalcolithic, Bronze and Iron Ages. What is unusual about Akhenaten's actions is the fact that Aten was still a relatively minor deity by the 14th century BC. Although there is evidence that the importance of the sun deities was growing in the Bronze Age world of the Eastern Mediterranean around this time, Akhenaten now went one major step further. For reasons which will remain elusive, he decided to proclaim the worship of Aten as a form of state religion. In this new religious system, the personification of the sun as a disk became central, stripped of many of the complex mythological elements which pertain to the worship of the sun through Ra and other more well-known sun gods. Although much of the material record of the worship of Aten was subsequently destroyed and wiped out by his successors, it is clear that temples were built or rededicated to the new god by Akhenaten, and inscriptions were set up on altars and worshipping sites to the new deity. The pharaoh even changed his name. It is from around this time at the end of the 1350s BC that he began being referred to as Akhenaten or Eknaten, meaning something akin to effective of Aten or one who is dedicated to Aten. The latter decision was not entirely unusual. Egyptian rulers and nobles were often named after different deities. Ramesses, the name borne by many of Akhenaten's successors, includes the name of the sun god Ra. Thutmose III, Akhenaten's great forebear of the 15th century BC, was named after Thoth, the god of wisdom and magic. The traditional nature of naming oneself after a god aside, the move towards active worship of just one deity was quite unusual for the time, one which effectively leaned towards a form of monotheism. Though, as we will see soon, there is a major debate amongst Egyptologists about the nature of the new religion. Before turning to the specifics of the new religion and how Akhenaten sought to expand it, it is worth trying to reconstruct the philosophical basis for it, a task which is made difficult by efforts to destroy the memory of Akhenaten's new religion by his successors. Firstly, the worship of Aten was perhaps derived in large part from outside influences. Whether from the Levant, the wider Middle East, or further afield, there are Semitic aspects to it. In this sense, Akhenaten's decision to adopt it as the state religion points towards the growing prosperity and cosmopolitan nature of the late Bronze Age world, one in which ideas trafficked between cultures over hundreds of kilometers. Secondly, it was something of a more personal religion insofar as it involved a more direct communication between the individual worshipper and the sun deity, whereas Egyptian religion in the main used intermediaries, priests who received the offerings of lay people and then offered them to the gods for them. One of the reasons why Akhenaten's innovations were possibly so violently reacted against after his death was that he was alleged to have attacked the privileges of the powerful priestly classes. These were some of the core traits of the new religion, and we see inscriptions from the time and images which show people making offerings directly to Aten without priests and temple officials involved. There is, as we have already noted, a wide-ranging debate amongst Egyptologists and historians of Akhenaten's reign over how we should classify this new system. The traditional view, back when the details of what Akhenaten had attempted and as modern Egyptology developed as a discipline in the early and mid-20th century, was that it was effectively a form of monotheism. This is the idea that one god should be worshipped exclusively. Christianity, Islam, and several other modern religious systems are monotheistic. By way of contrast, ancient Egypt and indeed most other ancient religious systems, such as those of Babylon, Greece, and Rome, were all polytheistic. That is, they worshipped multiple gods or a pantheon of sometimes hundreds of gods and goddesses. While it is tempting to see the brief experiment in the worship of Aten as a form of monotheism, it seems more plausible to describe it as a form of monolatry. This is where the existence of a wide pantheon of deities is still accepted, but one is now placed in a position of singular importance. The idea here is that Akhenaten was not trying to disavow the existence of the other gods and goddesses, but that he was proclaiming to his people that Aten should be worshipped above all others. There was also a form of syncretism involved, the borrowing of other cultural practices and incorporation of them within one's own system. The belief is that Akhenaten proposed affording Aten a position of singular importance within Egyptian religious life, influenced by outside ideas from the Middle East and the Mediterranean world about the importance of sun deities. Some have argued that this cult of a powerful sun deity might have origins in the religious systems of the Semitic people of the Levant and Middle East, and that Akhenaten was influenced by ideas which entered Egypt from this region, as the new kingdom expanded there during the reign of Thutmose III and his successors. One of the other core components of the new religion was to proselytize or spread it by acquiring large numbers of adherents. This is an issue which has concerned Egyptologists greatly, as they wonder if Akhenaten simply established a new cult and hoped it would acquire followers over time, or if he aggressively attacked the cults of other gods. The picture presented from the evidence of inscriptions and other material which has been recovered is complex. It is suggested that initially in the late 1350s and early 1340s BC, he began to introduce a new cult of Aten alongside other gods. But over time, this was expanded to favor the new cult of Aten when it came to royal patronage. Then, towards the end of the reign, there might have been a watershed moment at which he became much more aggressive and actually began trying to actively undermine the cults and temples of prominent deities like Ra, Baath, Amun, Thoth, Seth, Mut, and others. In particular, there was an active campaign of attacking worship of the god Amun, who had become, along with Ra, the most preeminent deity within the Egyptian pantheon by the 14th century BC, and who had an especially strong cult following in Thebes. As such, Akhenaten does seem to have actively tried to undermine the worship of other deities. but the degree to which he did so and whether or not it was evenly distributed amongst all the other gods and goddesses is a matter of debate. Another key aspect of Akhenaten's religious revolution was the establishment of a new capital dedicated to the worship of Aten. It isn't surprising to learn that ancient Egypt had different capitals at different times when we consider the enormously long span of ancient Egyptian history, one which would eventually play out over more than 3 millennia. In its earliest days, the capital was located in Thinis, a city which we still don't even know the location of today. Around the 27th century BC, the capital was moved to Menepha, or Memphis. This was located on the banks of the River Nile, just south of the delta and within the southern suburbs of modern-day Cairo. Not long afterwards, the pharaohs began building up the Great Pyramids at the Giza Plateau not far away from this new capital. Memphis remained the center of power and governance down to the end of the Old Kingdom. The capital then moved around at various times, spending nearly 3 centuries during the Middle Kingdom period at Ichtawi, but increasingly became fixed during the New Kingdom period at Thebes, much further down the River Nile at the site of modern-day Luxor and near the Valley of the Kings. The reasons were twofold. On the one hand, a more southerly position allowed the pharaohs to govern their new territories to the south in Sudan or Nubia more effectively, while Thebes' position was solidified during the period when the north was ruled by the Hyksos. Thebes had become a flourishing economic, commercial and religious center by the time the north was recaptured, and had remained the capital down to Akhenaten's time. He would briefly interrupt this primacy during his reign. Beginning around 1346 BC, Akhenaten initiated the construction of a new capital city 100 kilometers north of Thebes, on the right or east bank of the River Nile. Today we know the site as Amarna, though in ancient times it was called Akhetaten, meaning the horizon of the Aten, a name which indicates the choosing of the location as a place where the rising sun, coming east over Egypt, could be seen with great clarity. This was compounded by the fact that the city was centered on an acropolis or hill known to Egyptologists today as the Royal Wadi. The city was to be a dedicated governmental and religious center for the worship of Aten, and was to function as the seat of the royal court. This was largely a virgin or greenfield site which had little settlement on it prior to the beginning of the project, beyond a small village which might have been in the vicinity. Tens of thousands of laborers would have been deployed here in order to speed the construction work along, and large sections of the Egyptian economy must have been turned over to providing building material and other goods in order to erect a city out of nothing, a not inconsiderable project given the resources available to ancient states. The city, which emerged in nearly complete form by 1341 BC, if the dedication inscriptions on some buildings here are accurate, was spread out along a 13-kilometer stretch of territory on the east bank of the River Nile. It was divided into a north and south city. The north city was centered on a royal palace and mortuary area, which were to be the heart of the government or administrative zone. The south city encompassed more the village of the workers who erected the buildings, and would doubtlessly have become a more residential area once the building had been constructed if the city had remained in use as a capital for longer than it ultimately did. To the east of this was the Acropolis and the tomb of Akhenaten, an elaborate mortuary building which it is assumed was intended for the pharaoh. Finally, between the north city and the workers' village in the center of the development, there was the great temple of Aten. This elaborate temple complex of fine stones, statues, colonnaded arches and other religious edifices was to be the heart of the worship of Aten in Akhenaten's realms, and was elaborately designed. Many reliefs and wall drawings have been recovered which point to an extensive and refined level of building work here in the 1340s, replete with hundreds of altars for worshippers to make offerings to the god. The building work at Amarna and the art and architecture which began to emerge in Egypt more generally in the decade between the inception of the cult of Aten in 1346 BC and the end of Akhenaten's reign in the mid-1330s BC is very distinctive from other ancient Egyptian art. Indeed, so idiosyncratic is it that scholars talk of an Amarna style during the reign of Akhenaten. Statues become markedly different, with people depicted with much thinner and more austere faces with an almost feminine edge. These are distinct from the fuller and more regal-looking faces of nearly all other pharaohs. There was also a tendency to depict the royal family in a much more intimate way, with Akhenaten and Nefertiti presented together on wall reliefs and in statuary objects. Similarly, the headdresses and clothing worn are somewhat distinctive. Nefertiti's headgear in the famous bust of her is indicative of this, with Akhenaten's wife wearing a wig in a Nubian style. When it came to the temples and other religious spaces at Amarna, a marked difference was seen in the open nature of these sites. The high imposing walls punctuating sun courts, which were typical of ancient Egyptian religious buildings, were abandoned in favor of temples with small enclosure walls. The courts where the religious ceremonies were carried out and offerings made were now out in full view of the sun, so that worshippers could be in the presence of Aten entirely when attending his great temple at Amarna. Thus, Akhenaten's radical reforms extended beyond religion to how the royal government was depicted visually and presented itself to the people of Egypt. All of these decisions by Akhenaten have given rise to a major debate as to who he was on a personal level. This is almost impossible to determine when it comes to an ancient ruler. Kings and queens 3,500 years ago did not tend to write memoirs or anything of that kind that have survived and which might provide an insight into who they were as individuals. Instead, we are left to reconstruct this from other evidence. Some have argued Akhenaten was a visionary and religious radical. Others have argued he could have been insane or mentally unhinged in some fashion. There really is no way of knowing, though. Another theory, which has the benefit of being grounded on a vision of him as a political power broker, was that he was fostering the cult of the sun deity as a means of aggrandizing himself. Courts in New Kingdom Egypt were no different to more modern courts and governments, with various factions and power groups, some trying to undermine the ruler. Perhaps Akhenaten decided after years ruling from Thebes or Karnak to begin the worship of Aten and establish a new capital as a radical break from the old political system. The new religion would weaken the powerful priestly class and their followers and would centralize power in Akhenaten's hands, who in adopting his new name was intrinsically associating himself with the sun god. This view of him as a ruler trying to increase his own power by centralizing religious worship around him would also match with his decision to hold a said festival in Thebes not long after his accession, a move which, as we have seen, points towards some insecurity in his position as pharaoh. Ultimately, we can't be sure, but there are many things which might have motivated Akhenaten on a personal level. While Egyptologists and commentators on Akhenaten's reign have, for obvious reasons, commentated primarily on the religious innovations he introduced, there were other things occurring in the 15 or so years between his adoption of Aten as the state god and his movement of the capital to Amarna. Most of this centered on foreign policy matters. While Egypt had risen to a position of unprecedented power and prosperity in the Bronze Age world during the reigns of Thutmose III and his successors, the kingdom did face opposition from various fronts. There were numerous other strong powers in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. Generally, Egypt maintained good relations and extensive trading ties to the Greek powers, such as the Minoans of Crete and the Mycenaeans of the mainland, the latter of which had largely subjugated Crete after a devastating natural disaster around 1500 BC. But in the Middle East and Anatolia, it had rivals in the shape of the Hittite Empire and the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians were based out of Mesopotamia, or what we term Iraq today, and around this time were undergoing a major resurgence in their power under their ruler Ashur-uballit I. The Hittites were based out of Anatolia in modern-day Turkey and ruled southwards into the northern parts of Lebanon and Syria. During the Late Bronze Age, they were a perennial rival of Egypt's in this contested border zone. Beyond these, Akhenaten's government had to contend with raids out of the western deserts of Egypt and also the perennial possibility of the Nubians trying to free themselves from Egyptian domination down the River Nile into Sudan. We are fortunate when it comes to Akhenaten's foreign policy to have a major source of information of an unusual nature for a period in time 3.5 millennia ago. These are known as the Amarna letters. They are a series of 382 clay tablets which were discovered accidentally by some farmers in Amarna in the 1880s. They are unusual insofar as they are not written in Egyptian hieroglyphs, as one might expect, but rather in cuneiform writing, the type of script which was favored in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC by people like the Sumerians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, who were based out of Mesopotamia. The tablets nearly all date to Akhenaten's reign and record his diplomatic agreements with the Syrians and others and shed some light on his foreign policy. There are also numerous letters between the pharaoh and local rulers of parts of the Levant, some of whom were ostensibly vassal subjects of Akhenaten's in Canaan and other lands there in the mid-14th century BC. Interestingly, these vassal kings addressed Akhenaten as the Sun, my lord, perhaps indicating an awareness of the new solar religion Akhenaten was promoting at home, whereas the kings of Assyria and other large states addressed the pharaoh as a brother and equal. The Amarna letters and other evidence offer an interesting insight into Akhenaten's foreign policy in the Levant and wider Middle East. When it comes to the Assyrians, Akhenaten was primarily caught up in a diplomatic dispute between them and the Babylonians, a declining power that still controlled land in southern Mesopotamia towards the Gulf of Persia, despite the fact that the Assyrians had long since emerged from underneath the control of the Babylonians and were now the dominant power in the region. The Babylonian king Burnaburias II wrote to Akhenaten on 2 occasions, inquiring as to why the Egyptian pharaoh was entertaining diplomatic envoys from Ashur-uballit of Assyria. He would have received short shrift from Akhenaten, who presumably was negotiating an accord with the Assyrians against the Hittites. The latter, under their ruler Suppiluliuma I, did make raids into the Hittite-Egyptian border zone in Syria and Lebanon during the 1340s, though there was little of significance achieved by these. This perennial border conflict between the Hittites and Egyptians would continue for decades to come, peaking in the reign of Ramesses II a century later, when one of the most significant engagements in ancient history, the Battle of Kadesh, was fought between the two. The Amarna letters are nevertheless a very useful window into how diplomacy worked here in the Bronze Age, particularly on the nature of the vassal city-states and principalities in the border zone and how they communicated with the pharaohs in Egypt. A more significant military campaign was launched by Akhenaten to the south of his central kingdoms in Egypt. This occurred sometime in the middle of his reign, though the dating is not perfectly clear. Akhenaten did not lead the army himself, but dispatched his viceroy, the governor of much of Nubia, a man named Thutmose, to head southwards and quell a revolt amongst the perennially unruly Nubians. It was not unusual for a pharaoh to command an underling to lead such a military campaign when it came to Nubia. In any event, Thutmose treated the campaign as a routine military exercise, that such interventions largely were by that time, quickly bringing the unrest to an end. In the aftermath of it, several victory stelae or stone pillars were set up in parts of Egypt to commemorate the victory. Some Egyptologists have argued that there were other campaigns that Akhenaten might have engaged in, but all the evidence for these is very speculative. At the same time, we can probably dismiss the idea, which was favored a century ago, that Akhenaten was some sort of pacifist. The reality is that Egypt was in a strong position in the Levant when he ascended the throne, and the Hittites made little effort to reclaim lands in Syria and Lebanon during his reign, beyond a few border incursions and skirmishes. In such an environment, the pharaoh judiciously negotiated closer diplomatic ties with the Assyrians, kept his vassal rulers in the Levant pacified, and shored up Egyptian control over Nubia. This sensible foreign policy left him free to dedicate his time and the state's resources to his grand construction work and religious project in Amarna. In the end, Akhenaten's great enterprise was scuppered by ill health and mortality. In the 12th year of his rule, that is around 1340 BC, not long after the initial phase of building work had been completed at Amarna and the new city was opened, so to speak, a major festival was held there to celebrate Akhenaten's 12th year on the throne. This saw emissaries and perhaps even some rulers arriving from neighboring countries, and also from the vassal principalities and cities in the Levant, to pay homage to the pharaoh. This was quite possibly the source of the plague which struck Egypt in the early 1330s BC. A deadly plague or disease outbreak of some kind definitely occurred, and it may have been brought to the capital by these visiting dignitaries. Whatever the source of it was, the result was not good for the royal family. Several of Akhenaten's daughters were seemingly claimed by it, 3 of which, Meketeten, Neferneferure, and Setapenre, were daughters from his marriage to his great wife Nefertiti. Others still may have been impacted. One theory which has also emerged in recent years is that the plague was ravaging Egypt years earlier and that it may have actually been a cause of Akhenaten's religious reform program, the king having decided to embrace a new religion and god as the disease ravaged his country. This remains a hypothesis only, and there is little evidence to suggest the plague outbreak preceded the raising of the cult of Aten and the construction of Amarna. What Akhenaten died from himself is not known. There is, of course, a possibility that the plague took him when he died at some stage between 1336 and 1334 BC. It could also be that he was suffering from a lifelong illness. Egyptologists have long noted that on statues and other monuments and walls, he was typically depicted as being a much leaner and gaunt figure than other pharaohs of the New Kingdom period. Maybe this was how he wanted to be depicted, but it could also indicate he was suffering from something like Marfan syndrome or Froelich syndrome. Both are complicated conditions which are related to the endocrine system and other parts of the body. They would also both result in a long drooping face and jawline, such as the one Akhenaten was presented as having. At the same time, there are contradictions to any such diagnosis. Froelich syndrome, for instance, usually makes men sterile, and as we have seen, Akhenaten clearly did not have any problem having children. Given this, the more likely conclusion is that the unusual depiction of Akhenaten was wholly owing to his eccentric personality and the unusual art of the time, and not related to any illness of any kind. If this is the case, then his death in the mid-1330s BC at a relatively young age, perhaps being little more than in his mid-30s, was quite possibly owing to the plague that was coursing through Egypt at the time. He was buried at the royal tomb he had built at Amarna, though his mummy and sarcophagus were soon seemingly removed from there and perhaps taken to the Valley of the Kings near Thebes for internment next to his ancestors. The argument for Akhenaten having been ill for some time prior to his death is strengthened when we consider that there was a co-regency or co-rulership being developed in the last year or two of his life. The co-rulers were Nefertiti at one point and at another Smenkhare. The identity of the latter individual is unclear. He may have been a brother of Akhenaten's or one of his sons of an unclear background. This is significant when it comes to the question of who succeeded Akhenaten. Having died a relatively young man, his children were very young to succeed him in the main, and this Smenkhare, if he was a brother of the pharaoh, may have been chosen as a temporary successor due to being older. Yet the chronology is deeply confused and unclear, and Egyptologists debate whether Smenkhare was dead himself before Akhenaten. What is clear is that Tutankhamun, the famous pharaoh whose gold death mask has become synonymous with ancient Egypt, succeeded around 1332 BC, just a short while after Akhenaten's death. He was a boy of no more than 9 or 10 years at the time and is understood to have been one of Akhenaten's sons, though his parentage is debated. Though suffering from a genetic illness himself, he would live and rule down to the late 1320s BC, long enough to leave his own mark on Egyptian history, in overturning many of his father's reforms. While the period immediately following his reign and the exact changeover of rulers in the years that followed is imprecisely known, Egyptologists broadly agree on what happened during these years. Tutankhamun's reign saw a violent reaction against the unusual religious system Akhenaten had inaugurated. The worship of Aten was broadly abandoned, although the worship of sun deities, of course, remained central to the restored polytheistic system. The capital was also returned to Thebes. But things went much further still. A wave of iconoclasm ensued in which efforts were made to erase any memory of Akhenaten and the religious aberration he was perceived to have overseen. Amarna was abandoned, its temples and grand buildings were literally dismantled and paved over. Though in doing so, the destroyers did a great job of preserving the city under the sand, and it has been possible for archaeologists to retrieve much of it in recent decades. Inscriptions on public buildings, temples and monuments dating to his reign were erased. Statues and tombs which had been erected were defaced, often with the physical features of statues chiseled off. Official records were also evidently destroyed. This amounted to a concerted effort to destroy any memory of Akhenaten and the cult of Aten. So comprehensive was this campaign that it destroyed many records of Akhenaten's life and reign. And one of the reasons why we have such a limited knowledge of the circumstances of his early life and reign is owing to this effort to erase him from the historical record by his near successors. The campaign was quite effective. By the time of the long reign of Ramesses II in the following century, Egyptian society had largely forgotten the aberration Akhenaten had introduced. As successful as this campaign of destruction was, it did not stop the emergence of new forms of monotheism in the Near East in the centuries that followed. Judaism in its full form emerged in the Levant by the 11th century BC. Not long afterwards, the Persian philosopher Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, as 19th century German philologists like Friedrich Nietzsche termed him, established Zoroastrianism as a new faith, which was prominent in parts of what are now Iran and Iraq for centuries to come. The religious system of the Greeks was clearly polytheistic, but some local cults to deities like Apollo and Athena were so powerful that scholars argue they constituted a form of monolatry. The entire system rested on a belief in Zeus as an alleged king of the gods. Christianity emerged later out of Judaism, but incorporating significant elements of the Hellenic system, with many scholars arguing that the ideas of Zeus as a cloud god who ruled over the heavens was a major influence on the early development of the Church of the Followers of Christ. Other quasi-monotheistic sun deities such as Elagabal and Helios became prominent under Roman rule in the 3rd century CE before being overtaken by the rise of Christianity as the state religion of the late Roman Empire. Thus, by the time of the rise of Islam in the 7th century, monotheism was the rule rather than the exception to the religious life of Europe, the Maghreb and the Middle East. Akhenaten, rather than being an aberration, was something of a prophet of the future shift from polytheism to monotheism. Eventually, despite the best efforts of his children and other descendants to excise him from the historical record, details of Akhenaten's reign and religious innovations began to re-emerge. This began with the realization by 18th century European Orientalists visiting Egypt that there was a lost city on the site of Amarna, some remains of which were still visible above the sand. Archaeological excavations were undertaken there spasmodically in the 19th century, before the uncovering of the Amarna letters in the 1880s led to a more sustained interest in the Amarna site. Extensive studies were carried out here between the 1890s and the 1930s, and with this the story of what Akhenaten had attempted began to reveal itself after millennia of obscurity. In the process, Akhenaten has become one of the most studied of all ancient Egyptian pharaohs. As his rule was so unusual, there nevertheless remain unresolved issues surrounding it. For instance, in 1907, a tomb codenamed KV55 in the Valley of the Kings west of Thebes was discovered and was soon identified as the tomb of Akhenaten. A mummy was located here and as recently as 2010, scientific studies began to appear suggesting the mummy was most likely that of Akhenaten. Other Egyptologists have derided these claims though, arguing that Akhenaten was buried at Amarna and would hardly have been removed to the Valley of the Kings if he were considered such an abhorrent figure following his death. As with much else concerning his reign, there are more questions than answers, even after centuries of historical inquiry. Akhenaten is one of the most well-known of the Egyptian pharaohs today for one reason: his efforts to establish a new religious system in which the sun god Aten would have a position of primacy. This was not simply a personal religious preference on his part. The pharaoh was so dedicated to the god that he tried to establish him as the preeminent deity across Egypt, changed his name to acknowledge the worship of Aten, and built a new city to honor the deity. This might not have been strict monotheism and should be described more as monolatry, where the other gods and goddesses were still acknowledged, but made peripheral by comparison with the paramount god. It still seemed like an aberration to Akhenaten's subjects, and after his reign, his successors did their level best to eradicate any record or memory of what he had done. Yet it would be wrong to see this as an indication of insanity in Akhenaten. He knew what he was doing and deployed vast state resources to try to make it happen. In the end, what we might suggest is that his establishment of the cult of Aten was indicative of the changing religious and intellectual world of the cosmopolitan Late Bronze Age, one in which outside Semitic influences concerning sun deities were influencing Egyptian culture. And in the end, he was ahead of his time. Over the centuries that followed, there were numerous monotheistic faiths which emerged in the Mediterranean world and that of the Middle East. Though it would take another 2 millennia for it to occur, eventually they would conquer all before them. What do you think of Akhenaten? Was he something of an aberration and perhaps insane as some of his contemporaries seemed to believe? Or was he simply a visionary who predicted the general drift from polytheism to monotheism in the ancient world? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. The man known to history as Tutankhamun was born in the middle of the 14th century BC during the 18th dynasty of ancient Egypt. Although we cannot be sure of his exact date or even year of birth, it is generally agreed that it occurred sometime in the late 1340s BC. Tutankhamun's parentage is disputed, though his father was most probably Akhenaten, who ruled Egypt as Amenhotep IV before he established a monotheistic religion known as Atenism, focused on the worship of the sun disk Aten. Beginning about 5 years before Tutankhamun was born, around the same time he changed his name to Akhenaten. Akhenaten had at least 6 daughters with his great royal wife Queen Nefertiti. It is possible that she was also Tutankhamun's mother. Alternatively, his mother may have been a wife of Akhenaten's, known only as the Younger Lady. At the time of his birth, Tutankhamun was given the name Tutankhaten, or the living image of Aten, in honor of the sun god. Despite being one of the best-known pharaohs or kings of ancient Egypt, as a result of the discovery of his tomb and famous death mask by Howard Carter in 1922, details of Tutankhamun's short life and reign are still being pieced together by archaeologists and Egyptologists, using artifacts from his tomb and other evidence. He is likely to have been born in Amarna, the modern-day name of Akhetaten, the short-lived capital city founded by his father on the eastern bank of the River Nile, around 200 miles to the south of Egypt's modern-day capital of Cairo. The young Egyptian prince was born with a club foot on his left leg, forcing him to use a walking stick throughout his life. He was brought up by his wet nurse, a woman named Maya from his father's harem. Among the artifacts found in Tutankhamun's tomb are toys he owned and played with as a child, including an ivory monkey with moving arms and a small wooden bird. At around the age of 4, he learned how to write, starting with the cursive hieratic script, used on a daily basis before moving on to the formal and sacred hieroglyphs found on ancient Egyptian monuments. Tutankhaten learned to write by copying out ancient texts, which also offered political wisdom for kings and princes preparing for kingship. He would also have studied administration, geography, history, diplomacy, and religion, as well as the theory and practice of warfare, which included chariot riding and archery. Tutankhaten grew up during a revolutionary period in Egyptian history, driven by his father's religious changes. The traditional Egyptian polytheistic belief system involved the worship of many different gods, amongst whom the creator god Amun and the sun god Ra were most prominent. However, Akhenaten had introduced the cult of Aten, a sun god depicted as a golden disk with rays of light radiating downwards in a fan. While Akhenaten allowed his subjects to continue worshipping the traditional gods, only stipulating that Aten was the supreme god, by the 9th year of his reign, a few years before Tutankhaten's birth, Aten was increasingly portrayed as the preeminent deity. Under the new religion, the Aten was regarded as the creator of the world and everything within it, and each morning at sunrise, the king would make offerings to the Aten at the temples he built in his capital. Akhenaten identified as the son of Aten and served as the chief priest of his cult, and it is possible that Tutankhaten received his religious instruction directly from his father. During his travels with his tutors across the country, the prince may have seen the names of the old gods being removed from the monuments, even while many people continued to worship them. The boy may also have noticed the different artistic styles in the old temples and the new civic buildings rising up from the desert around him in Akhenaten. Around the 14th year of Akhenaten's reign, when Tutankhaten was around 6 years old, the latter's sister or half-sister, Princess Meketaten, died at the age of 10. While her cause of death remains unknown, a plague had been spreading throughout the eastern Mediterranean world. In any case, an infectious disease is a likely explanation, as Neketaten's youngest sisters, Nefer-Nefer-Yer and Setepenra, also died around this time. Older female members of the family followed, including Tutankhaten's grandmother, Queen Tia, and Akhenaten's secondary wife, Queen Kia. Following these deaths in the royal family, Akhenaten hoped to secure his succession and the continuation of his religious reforms by naming a man named Smenkhare, possibly a relative of his, as his co-regent. This Smenkhare was responsible for the construction of a great hall in Akhenaten's royal palace and was expected to be Akhenaten's successor, but died after a year or two. Akhenaten died around the same time, in what was possibly the 17th year of his reign, and around 1336 BC. Following Akhenaten's death, the throne possibly passed to Smenkhare for a brief time before his death, and then appears to have passed to a king named Nefer-Nefer-Uaten, who may have ruled as co-regent alongside Tutankhaten. The new king is believed to have been a royal woman and may have been the eldest daughter of Meritaten, or more likely his great wife Nefertiti. King Nefer-Nefer-Uaten continued to develop the cult of Aten, but was prepared to reintroduce the cult of Amun and the other gods in order to appease the followers of the traditional faith. She abandoned her plans to build a tomb at Akhenaten and instead ordered craftsmen to build a tomb and mortuary temple in the Valley of Kings near Thebes, modern-day Luxor, the traditional capital and royal burial ground for the kings of Egypt in the 2nd millennium BC. The Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass theorized that Nefer-Nefer-Uaten also moved her capital to Thebes, but Shaw suggests that she remained in Akhetaten, in the palace she shared with her late husband. However, she would only live another 2 years, leaving the throne to the 10-year-old Tutankhaten. By the time he ascended to the throne, the 10-year-old King Tutankhaten was still a child receiving his education and could not be expected to exercise royal power by himself. He was therefore advised by courtiers and officials much older than him, who had served his father Akhenaten. His most influential advisor was Ai, a relative who may have been the brother of his grandmother, Queen Tai, while a man named Mea controlled the treasury. As for military matters, the young king relied on the advice of General Horemheb, commander of the Egyptian army. Although these men had dutifully promoted Artanism during the previous reigns, the calamities of recent years, including the plague and the deaths of royal family members in quick succession, were interpreted as a sign of divine punishment for neglecting the worship of the old gods. With Akhenaten and Nefertiti gone, Tutankhamun's courtiers now had the opportunity to educate the new pharaoh in the old religion and persuade him to return to the old ways and restore divine favor to the realm. Although the king's advisors wielded considerable power and influence, Tutankhamun would have been required to perform ceremonial tasks and to announce important decisions in person, even as a child ruler. As with all Egyptian pharaohs, he had important religious duties as chief priest of the state religion. As part of the coronation ceremony that marked his assumption of royal authority, the young king was transformed from a human being into a living god. The rituals were conducted according to the old traditions, with offerings made to Amun, his wife, the mother goddess Mut, and their son Khonsu, god of the moon. Priests and priestesses represented gods and goddesses who placed various crowns upon the king's head, including the red crown of Lower Egypt, the white crown of Upper Egypt, and the blue crown worn by 18th dynasty pharaohs or kings during war and religious ceremonies. The king was then given his crook and flail, symbols of royal power in Egypt. According to Egyptian royal tradition, the pharaoh would have chosen 4 extra names to reflect his personal qualities and regal majesty. Of these 4 royal names, only one is known. His throne name, Nebkheperure, meaning Lord of Manifestations, is Ra. While Tutankhamun still used his birth name when he assumed the throne, not long afterward the Aten in the king's name was replaced with Amun. Thus Tutankhamun became Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun. King Tutankhamun would have been crowned alongside his wife and half-sister Ankhesenamun, one of the daughters of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. The marriage of siblings in this way was commonplace amongst the royals of ancient Egypt. She was a year older than Tutankhamun, and the two had already been married when the latter became king. Ankhesenamun appears to have been his only queen. The 18th dynasty was known for its powerful queens, and Ankhesenamun would have learned about the deeds of her illustrious ancestor Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh who reigned a century and a half earlier and built a grand mortuary temple in the Theban necropolis near the Valley of the Kings. She had also just seen her mother, Nefertiti, rule Egypt as King Nefer-Neferuaten. Accordingly, Ankhesenamun was present alongside Tutankhamun throughout his reign for royal ceremonies and audiences, and corresponded with foreign rulers in her own name. Her most important duties included serving as the manifestation of the Egyptian goddesses during religious ceremonies. Of course, as in almost all other monarchies, the queen's main task was to continue the dynastic lineage by bearing the king's children. Ankhesenamun was pregnant twice, but on both occasions her daughters were stillborn. Early in his reign, Tutankhamun's advisors persuaded him to move his capital away from Akhetaten, with power being returned to the cities of Memphis in northern Egypt near the Nile Delta and Thebes in the south. Memphis had been the capital of the Old Kingdom of Egypt in the 3rd millennium BC, when the Great Pyramids and Sphinx were built on the Giza Plateau near the city. Thereafter, Thebes had become the capital. Following the establishment of the 18th dynasty in the mid-16th century BC, Memphis regained its importance as a political center. While Akhenaten built a temple of Aten in the city, from Memphis and Thebes, Tutankhamun and his advisors embarked on the complete reversal of Akhenaten's religious reforms. The king issued a royal decree, which stated that during the previous reigns, the old gods had been neglected and withdrawn their divine protection. As a result, Egypt was in chaos, and its armies had been defeated on the battlefield. The text adds that after Tutankhamun came to the throne and moved his court to Memphis, the old gods were venerated once again and prosperity was restored to the land. The proclamation was inscribed into stone stele in prominent locations around the country, such as the Temple of Karnak in Thebes. Although the text of these restoration stele claimed that all was well once again, in reality the process of restoration was just beginning. Tutankhamun had been brought up at his father's court in Amarna, surrounded by depictions of Aten on palace walls, and witnessed his father taking part in the elaborate rituals of worshipping the sun disk every morning. To issue a proclamation discrediting the belief system he grew up with must have been a difficult experience for the young king. The king's closest advisors, Maya, and Horemheb, had risen to positions of influence during the reign of Akhenaten, and had tombs made for them in Amarna with Atenist inscriptions, but they formed the vanguard of the move back to tradition. Is believed to have been the power behind the throne. By the end of Tutankhamun's reign, he may have assumed the office of Grand Vizier. Treasury Chief Maya was also responsible for royal construction projects, and it was he who began the work of restoring the temples to the old gods. While Akhenaten had ordered the destruction of images of the old gods, in particular Amun, Tutankhamun ordered his chief sculptor, Usharhadhatiye, to repair the images or to make new ones from scratch. Meanwhile, Horemheb personally appointed men to fill the priesthoods that had been left vacant during Akhenaten's reign. Interestingly, though the temples of Aten in Amarna were closed, the temple of Aten in Memphis remained open. Around 2 or 3 years into Tutankhamun's reign, with the revival of the old religion very much underway, the former capital of Akhetaten was being abandoned by its inhabitants, taking the bodies of their relatives with them. King Tutankhamun followed suit and decided to exhume the tombs in the royal cemetery to the east of Amarna and transfer their contents to the Valley of the Kings, which had served as the royal necropolis for the pharaohs and their family members from the reign of Thutmose I at the beginning of the 15th century BC until Akhenaten's move to Amarna. Tutankhamun ordered a new tomb to be created in the Valley of the Kings, in which he placed the body of his father Akhenaten in a coffin, originally intended for Queen Kia. The body of Tutankhamun's grandmother, Queen Tia, was buried in the tomb of her husband, King Amenhotep III. As part of his duties as high priest, Tutankhamun traveled across the country to attend religious festivals. As he lacked familiarity with the complex old rituals, he relied on assistance from his chief advisor, Every year, Tutankhamun would celebrate the Opet festival in Thebes. The ceremony began at the Temple of Karnak, where the king stood before 3 model boats carrying statues of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu, the 3 gods known collectively as the Theban Triad. After making offerings, the king led a procession to the Nile, followed by the priests carrying the boats on their shoulders. The king, queen, and effigies of the 3 gods would then travel up the river to another temple, while soldiers and courtiers marched along the riverbanks to the sound of religious hymns, sung by priests and accompanied by royal musicians. Once inside the main temple of Thebes, Tutankhamun and his priests would proceed into the inner sanctum to reenact the coronation ceremony and renew the king's divine power. While construction of the Luxor temple had begun during the reign of his grandfather, Amenhotep III, Tutankhamun carried on building work in the temple and had the colonnade hall decorated with images of him and Ankhesenamun taking part in the Opet festival. In addition to restoring the images and monuments of the old gods throughout the country, Tutankhamun initiated building projects of his own. Aside from the colonnade hall in the Temple of Luxor, he ordered the construction of a Sphinx Avenue at Karnak. Near the pyramids of Giza, Tutankhamun built a small palace for himself, which served as a hunting lodge. In his day-to-day activities, the king was assisted by his palace administration, headed by the High Steward of Memphis, Epi, who had formerly managed Akhenaten's palace at Amarna. After Epi's death, His office was assumed by Inuia, who had previously worked as a scribe for Maya at the treasury. As in modern royal households, a team of servants was responsible for the royal crowns and the king's vast wardrobe, which included outfits for every possible occasion. Tutankhamun's kingdom extended beyond the modern-day borders of Egypt. To the south, Egypt ruled Nubia in what is now Sudan. To the northeast, the Egyptian pharaohs vassalized the rulers of the Levant, the eastern Mediterranean region including Israel, Lebanon, Palestine and Syria. Many of these conquests were carried out by Thutmose III, the stepson of Hatshepsut, who ruled a century before Tutankhamun and was one of the greatest military commanders in ancient Egyptian history. Accordingly, Tutankhamun held audiences with his vassals and with foreign rulers, during which he would receive expensive gifts. Many of these gifts would have been given to the temple as offerings to the gods, but the king would keep some for himself, which were later found in his tomb. General Horemheb played a vital role in these meetings, transmitting messages between the king and his foreign visitors via an interpreter. As commander-in-chief of Tutankhamun's armies, Horemheb was also responsible for putting down a Nubian uprising in the 1320s BC. While Horemheb campaigned both in Nubia and in the Levant, it is unclear if the king himself was present at the battles. Although there are depictions of Tutankhamun firing arrows from his chariot, these were most likely idealized images, as the king's youth and disability would have hampered his ability to play an active part in battles. The Nubian territories were administered by a government official with the title of Viceroy of Kush. Tutankhamun appointed as his viceroy a man named Hui, who happened to be married to the chief of the royal harem. Hui supervised the collection of tribute for the king from the Nubians, including vast quantities of gold, ebony, ivory tusks, and other artistic objects. A few years into Tutankhamun's reign, Hui returned to the king's court with the tribute, accompanied by a procession of Nubian princes and prisoners of war, perhaps captured during Horemheb's campaign. After a decade of hardship, the attendees at the ceremony welcomed this sign of a return to prosperity. The old gods had been returned to their rightful places. Memories of the Atenist heresy were gradually fading away, and the abandoned city of Amarna had been systematically dismantled, and the remaining traces of it were being covered by the desert sands. The teenage Tutankhamun seemed secure on his throne and could be expected to exercise power in his own right within a few years. Perhaps a new golden age was imminent after the heresy of the reign of Akhenaten. During Akhenaten's reign, the Egyptians lost control of the Levantine city of Kadesh, on the border of Syria and Lebanon, a major trade hub at the time. The Hittites of eastern Turkey were expanding their empire into the Levant and captured Kadesh, replacing the Egyptian vassal Shutatara with his son Atekama, who supported the Hittites while publicly maintaining his allegiance to Egypt. Though Akhenaten had sent a military expedition to Kadesh, it failed to retake the city from the Hittites. Late in Tutankhamun's reign, the king sent Horemheb with an army aiming to retake Kadesh and reverse the humiliation suffered during his father's reign. Horemheb's campaign was commemorated in war scenes commissioned by Tutankhamun, but there is no further detail on how the campaign transpired. The city of Kadesh stood in the middle of a meander of the river Orontes, with trees all around, terrain that was unfamiliar to the Egyptians. Although the depictions of the campaign show Horemheb returning to Egypt with Atekama as a prisoner of war, along with Egyptian soldiers successfully storming a fortress, the Egyptians failed to recapture Kadesh, which remained in Hittite hands until the Egyptian king Seti I briefly reconquered the city in the early 13th century BC. Even without achieving the primary aim of taking Kadesh, the Egyptian depictions of the campaign, which could be pure propaganda, show the Egyptian commander parading Hittite prisoners in front of Tutankhamun. The king duly provided Horemheb with rich rewards, before going to the temple of Karnak to deposit a share of the spoils of war for the gods. Some of the prisoners captured by Horemheb may have been executed as a sacrifice to the gods. While Horemheb was away on campaign, Tutankhamun presided over the celebrations of the New Year festival. On the first day of the new year, Tutankhamun sat on his royal throne as gifts from the royal workshops and foreign dignitaries were laid down in front of his feet. These gifts would be meticulously recorded by scribes, and the king would distribute a selection of them to his courtiers. In the evening, Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun invited their courtiers to a banquet. The guests ate bread along with duck, ox meat, and goose, while the king was given food that had been purified at the temple fit for a god. The New Year celebration was accompanied by large quantities of beer and wine from the royal vineyards. The king and his courtiers may have ended the day's celebration by playing one of the board games that was found in his tomb early in the 20th century. A popular game was Senet, played on a board with 30 squares and at least 10 counters. While the rules of the game have been lost and may have evolved over the centuries, the game is likely a variation of the royal game of the oldest board game in existence, dating to around 3000 BC, where players threw dice or knuckle bones and raced their counters to the end of the board. Two of the game sets found in Tutankhamun's tomb were designed for travel and contained small drawers to hold the counters, and the king and queen may have kept themselves entertained with this during their travels across the country. Around the time of the New Year festivities, the Apis bull in Memphis had died. The bull was worshipped as an incarnation of the god Ptah, a creator god whose worship was centered in Memphis. After the death of each bull, the city priests would search for the next incarnation with the same characteristics: a black bull with a white diamond on the top of its head, and an eagle pattern on its back. Before the priests could begin their search, Tutankhamun presided over the burial ceremony for the bull at the Serapeum, the burial site for the sacred bulls in the ancient royal necropolis of Saqqara, which may have been founded by Tutankhamun's grandfather Amenhotep III. The king would have hoped that these rituals would bring his army's glory in the Levant. As he shouldered more of the burdens of government in his late teens, Tutankhamun enjoyed the opportunity to relax by going hunting. While the most common hunting weapon was the bow and arrow, the king also hunted birds from a boat using a curved throw stick, much like a boomerang. For close combat, he had his choice of clubs, maces, or swords. The young king enjoyed hunting while riding in a chariot, firing arrows from his bow while a charioteer steered the horses. Among the items found in Tutankhamun's tomb is a wooden chest illustrated with hunting scenes, depicting the king in his chariot with his bow drawn, targeting the mass of fleeing animals about to fall prey to his arrows. Yet this taste for hunting would prove fatal. During the 9th year of his reign, Tutankhamun was out hunting when he fell from his chariot. As the king fell to the ground, he broke his left leg and lay bleeding. His servants carried him back to his palace and onto his bed. With Ankhesenamun at his side, the injured king was attended by the royal doctors and the priests of Sekhmet. As the doctors examined the wound, they realized that little could be done to save the king. Nevertheless, they did all they could in the circumstances and wrapped the king's leg in linen soaked in oil and honey to hold the leg in place and stop the bleeding. Despite their best efforts, the king's leg became infected, and within a matter of days, the 19-year-old king Tutankhamun was dead after just 9 years on the throne. There would be no long and prosperous reign, and the Egyptian kingdom was in turmoil once again. With the death of her husband, Ankhesenamun appears to have been the remaining survivor from amongst Akhenaten's children, and ruled as regent in the absence of an obvious successor. While it would have been possible for her to follow in her mother's footsteps and rule in her own right, the court decided she should marry a man who would become pharaoh. The pharaohs of the 18th dynasty were accustomed to marrying their own family members, but there were no close relatives left. As Ankhesenamun insisted on marrying a man of royal status, she took the surprising decision of sending a message to the Hittite king, Suppiluliuma I, explaining the situation in Egypt and asking if he could offer a solution in the form of a son who would marry her and become pharaoh in place of her late husband. When Suppiluliuma received the letter 2 weeks later, he could hardly believe what he was being offered. He had been fighting the Egyptians in the Levant for decades, and now he had an opportunity to incorporate Egypt into his empire in an instant. Nevertheless, he remained cautious and decided to send an envoy to Egypt to find out if the offer was genuine, or if Tutankhamun was alive and well, and the whole scheme had been an elaborate Egyptian ruse to cripple Hittite power. Ankhesenamun was not pleased to learn that the Hittite king had not immediately accepted her offer, as she was in something of a race against time. Traditionally, a pharaoh would be buried 70 days after dying, but the late king could not be buried without a successor in place. Without carrying out the necessary rituals for his burial, Tutankhamun's passage to his eternal afterlife would be blocked. With winter approaching, there was no chance that Ankhesenamun would get an answer from the Hittite king within 70 days. Nevertheless, the royal artisans hurried to prepare the items for Tutankhamun's tomb that would help his journey into the afterlife. Egyptian kings typically had their grave goods made far in advance, but Tutankhamun had reigned for only 9 years and died unexpectedly when still very young. While for most of his reign, artists and sculptors had been busy restoring the temples of the old gods rather than producing his funerary goods. No matter how fast they worked, the royal artisans could not be expected to make an entire assemblage of grave goods for Tutankhamun within a mere 70 days, but they could repurpose those prepared for Nefer-Neferuaten, which for some reason or other remained unused. The most spectacular object among these items was a golden death mask, which the late king's goldsmiths changed to bear his likeness while replacing the name Nefer-Neferuaten with Tutankhamun. In addition to the items intended for Nefer-Neferuaten, the artisans selected hundreds, if not thousands, of items either owned by the late king or kept in the palace storerooms. Also intended for burial in Tutankhamun's tomb were the mummified remains of his 2 stillborn daughters in tiny coffins. Although work had started on a tomb for Tutankhamun, it was by no means ready. As Maya and other officials inspected the Valley of the Kings near Thebes for an alternative tomb, they decided to use the one being prepared for Ai, the late king's chief advisor and distant relative. The undecorated tomb was not yet suitable for Tutankhamun, and the craftsmen were ordered to excavate a new chamber that would become the king's burial chamber, together with a small room beyond it known as the treasury. The 2 existing rooms in the tomb would later be known as the antechamber and the annex. After excavating the burial chamber, the royal craftsmen painted the walls, transferring existing designs from papyrus prepared during the Amarna period. In accordance with the traditions of the time, Tutankhamun had the mortuary temple built for him in the Theban necropolis, where priests would make offerings to keep his spirit alive in the afterlife. The late king's body was taken nearby to be embalmed, preserving his body as a vessel into which his soul could return to rest. His brain and internal organs were removed, including his heart, which was typically left inside the body. Traditionally, the internal organs would have been placed in canopic jars, but Tutankhamun's were placed in a chest divided into 4 compartments protected by the goddesses Isis, Nephthys, Neith, and Serket. The king's body was covered with natron, a salt used in the mummification process to dry out the body and stop it from decaying. After 40 days, the natron was removed and the body was wrapped in linen bandages, interspersed with amulets and other pieces of jewelry, while 2 daggers were placed on his body. The king's hands were crossed in front of his body, holding his crook and flail. On Tutankhamun's head, the embalmers placed Akhenaten's skull cap and the royal diadem between layers of bandages, all covered by the golden death mask, the final and most spectacular item on the mummy. Early the next year, the Hittite envoy was able to return to Suppiluliuma's capital of Hattusa, in what is now central Turkey, alongside an Egyptian envoy bearing a letter from Ankhesenamun. The queen was outraged that the Hittite king had not believed her and repeated her offer once again. Suppiluliuma continued to have his suspicions, but was persuaded by both his own envoy and the Egyptian messenger that the offer from the Egyptian queen was genuine. He duly dispatched his 4th son, Prince Zananza to travel to Egypt to marry Queen Ankhesenamun and become the new pharaoh. When Zananza died en route to Egypt in unclear circumstances, his father accused the Egyptians of murdering him. Upon the death of her prospective husband, Ankhesenamun decided she had no choice other than to marry the elderly Ai, her grand uncle, who became the new king. In his correspondence with his Hittite counterpart, King Ai acknowledged that Zananza was dead but denied any wrongdoing. Suppiluliuma responded by launching an invasion of Egyptian territories in the Levant, only for the captured Egyptian prisoners to bring the plague, which had been troubling Egypt for many years, to Hattusa, a disease outbreak which killed the Hittite king. With Ai in place as Tutankhamun's successor, the late king's funeral was scheduled for the end of March, 7 months after his death, much later than was typical. On the north wall of the burial chamber, the artists hurriedly painted the figure of Ai performing the opening of the mouth ritual on his predecessor's body, a ceremonial act symbolizing rebirth in the afterlife. This ceremony was typically led by the crown prince, strengthening Ai's tenuous claims to Tutankhamun's throne. There was no time to build a wall separating the burial chamber from the antechamber, so only 3 walls were decorated for the time being. The scenes from Tutankhamun's burial ritual had already been painted on the walls of his burial chamber before the ceremony had taken place. The king's mummified body was presented with food and drink before being placed on a sled and dragged across the sands up the slopes of the Valley of the Kings into the tomb that had been prepared for him. Before the body entered the tomb, Ai performed the opening of the mouth ceremony by gently touching Tutankhamun's lips with an adze, allowing him to speak in the afterlife. With his mummy carried by priests, the late king entered the darkness of his tomb and was placed into 3 nested coffins inside a red sarcophagus. The innermost coffin was made of solid gold, while the outer 2 were made of wood and decorated with glass and jewels. After the lids were placed on each of the 3 nested coffins, they were sealed with resin, but the heavy granite lid of the sarcophagus cracked and had to be repaired. The workmen then discovered the lid could not close properly, as the feet of the outer coffin were too tall and had to be filed down before the sarcophagus could be sealed tight. The workers then put together the wooden panels forming the 4 shrines that covered the king's body, but in their haste assembled the shrine the wrong way round, swapping east and west and north and south. In the meantime, Tutankhamun's canopic chest was placed in a shrine on the east wall of the treasury, with a box containing the remains of Tutankhamun's stillborn daughters placed nearby. At the entrance to the treasury, a shrine containing items used in the king's mummification was guarded by a jackal representing the god Anubis, the god of funerary rites. After the funeral, the artisans built the 4th wall of the burial chamber, decorating it with a scene of Tutankhamun in the afterlife, in the traditional artistic style. After their work was done, the entrance to the tomb was blocked, covered with plaster and stamped with official seals. Several months later than anticipated, Tutankhamun could begin his journey to the afterlife, where he would be engaged in a daily cosmic battle alongside the gods against the forces of evil that threatened to disrupt the earthly world. Yet the late king's continued existence in the afterlife could only be guaranteed if the priests at his mortuary temple continued to utter his name, and if his tomb and body were to remain undisturbed. After King Ai assumed the throne, Tutankhamun's prospects for an afterlife seemed bleak. Although he had married Ankhesenamun to legitimize his authority as pharaoh, Ai quickly elevated his existing wife, Te, as his great royal wife. Ankhesenamun was not featured in any of his royal inscriptions and disappears from the historical record. As far as Tutankhamun's spirit was concerned, worse was to follow, when his tomb was broken into twice within the space of a year. The thieves may have been artisans who had worked on the tomb and knew the layout, and they carried out various small precious items that could not be traced back to the tomb. While the authorities made some attempt to tidy up the ransacked tomb, not everything returned to its original place, and the tomb was simply resealed. Within a year of Tutankhamun's burial, a heavy rainstorm broke out over the Valley of Kings, and deposited a meter of rubble over the entrance of the tomb, ensuring that the tomb of Tutankhamun would remain undisturbed for over 3,000 years. After reigning for around 4 years, the elderly King Ai died. His designated successor, General Nachtmin, who may have been his son, died shortly before him. Since Ankhesenamun was either already dead or in any case out of the picture, the succession was claimed by Horemheb, the highest-ranking courtier. As Tutankhamun had been buried in Ai's intended tomb, Ai chose to take over the tomb in the western Valley of the Kings, originally intended for Tutankhamun but not finished before his death. Unlike Ai, Horemheb had no royal blood whatsoever, though his great royal wife, Mutnejmet, may have been Ai's daughter. While he continued his military campaigns against the Nubians and the Hittites, the new king considered it his primary duty to restore political order at home. While Horemheb continued Tutankhamun and Ai's work to restore the old religion, he decided to erase the memory of his immediate predecessors, replacing their names on temples and monuments with his own. By doing so, he not only consigned their names to oblivion in the mortal world, but extinguished their spirits in the afterlife. Not only did Horemheb order the desecration of Ai's tomb and the possible destruction of his mummy, he also usurped his predecessor's mortuary temple. He took credit for Tutankhamun and Ai's construction projects at the temples of Luxor and Karnak. All over the country, Horemheb replaced Tutankhamun's imagery with his own. He would undoubtedly have done the same thing to Tutankhamun's tomb, but it was more difficult to access after being buried under rubble. As Horemheb had no surviving children of his own, he named as his successor a senior official named Paramesu. After a reign of around 14 years, Horemheb died and his successor assumed the throne as Ramesses I, the founder of a new 19th dynasty. The second and third pharaohs of the 19th dynasty, Seti I and Ramesses II, the latter of whom is more widely known as Ramesses the Great, were warrior kings who helped to restore much of the prestige lost in the aftermath of the Amarna period. Horemheb's efforts to erase the memory of this period had been so successful that over time memory of King Tutankhamun faded away. In the mid-12th century BC, around 200 years after Tutankhamun's burial, the men working on the tomb of Ramesses VI built their huts directly above the rubble that covered the entrance to Tutankhamun's tomb. Over the course of the following 3 millennia, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Saladin, and Napoleon Bonaparte all conquered Egypt without ever hearing of the existence of the pharaoh named Tutankhamun. It seemed that memory of his reign had been almost entirely lost to history. When Napoleon Bonaparte led his expedition to Egypt in 1798, he was accompanied not only by his officers and men, but also by a large team of scientists to study the artistic legacy of the ancient Egyptians. Egyptian artifacts, including the Rosetta Stone, were brought back to Europe for further examination. In the 1820s, Jean-François Champollion successfully deciphered the hieroglyphic script of the ancient Egyptians, using the Rosetta Stone. This initiated the modern study of ancient Egypt, or Egyptology as it is known. Over the course of the 19th century, Egypt fell under the influence of British and French officials. The European interest in Egypt was partly economic, motivated by a desire to link the Mediterranean and the Red Sea by the Suez Canal, but interest in Egyptian heritage also played a part. Although officially part of the Ottoman Empire, Egypt was effectively ruled by the British from 1882 onwards. Wealthy aristocrats and businessmen from Europe and the United States flocked to Egypt and applied to the Egyptian Antiquities Service for permits to carry out excavations. These wealthy individuals financed the archaeological digs and hired Egyptologists to carry out the work, laying claim to a share of the finds. By the end of the 19th century, archaeological activity was underway at sites throughout Egypt which would have been familiar to Tutankhamun, his father's capital of Akhetaten, the ancient capital Memphis, the monumental religious buildings at Thebes, the mortuary temples and tombs of the Theban necropolis, and, most importantly, the Valley of the Kings. The concession to dig in the Valley of the Kings was considered the most prestigious among the archaeologists working in Egypt, who all aspired to be the first to discover an intact royal tomb, as most of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings had been plundered by grave robbers either in antiquity or in more recent times. Between 1905 and 1914, the concession was held by American businessman Theodore Davis. In February 1905, the intact tomb of Yuya and Thuya, the parents of Queen Tia, and accordingly the great-grandparents of Tutankhamun, had been discovered intact by James Quibell, a British Egyptologist sponsored by Davis. By this point, Tutankhamun's name was known to the archaeologists working in Egypt, as his name appeared on the inscriptions of tombs of officials, but otherwise his life and reign remained a mystery. Over the course of a decade, Davis had financed the discovery of more than 10 further tombs in the Valley of the Kings, including a small chamber containing gold foil depicting a king on a chariot bearing the names of Tutankhamun, Ankhesenamun, and Ai, which Davis identified as the tomb of Tutankhamun. By 1914, Davis gave up his concession and declared that the entire valley had been exhausted. Between 1905 and 1908, Davis had been assisted by Howard Carter, a British archaeologist who had previously worked as an inspector for the Antiquities Service before his resignation in the summer of 1905, several months after an incident involving Egyptian guards and French tourists caused him to be reassigned. By 1909, following the recommendation of Gaston Maspero, the director of the Antiquities Service, Carter began his collaboration with George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, who began to visit Egypt every year to help his recovery from a car accident. When Davis gave up his concession for the Valley of the Kings, Carter and Carnarvon believed that there were more discoveries to be made in the area and successfully obtained permission to dig. The outbreak of the First World War disrupted their plans, as Carnarvon was unable to travel to Egypt, while Carter worked in Cairo as an intelligence officer and did not have the time to carry out any new excavations. Yet, in his spare time, Carter continued to examine the map of the Valley of the Kings and focused on the Central Valley, the region where the tombs of Horemheb and the reburied Amarna royals had been discovered by Davis. He was not convinced that Tutankhamun's tomb had already been found and theorized that the king's tomb still awaited discovery. By 1917, Carter was able to begin work to test his theories, but after 5 years of excavating, nothing of real significance had been found, certainly not any intact royal tomb. By 1922, Lord Carnarvon had lost hope and informed Carter that he was withdrawing his sponsorship. The archaeologist urged his patron to give him one last chance, pointing to the group of workmen's huts near the tomb of Ramesses VI, which had not been cleared to the bedrock. Carter was even prepared to finance an extra season of digging himself, so long as Carnarvon authorized him to carry out the work under his permit. Impressed by Carter's determination, he agreed to sponsor one final season of work. On the 1st of November 1922, Carter's team began to remove the workmen's huts. On the 4th of November, the team stumbled upon a single step, before uncovering a doorway leading to a sealed tomb. Although the tomb did not look like a royal tomb, and he could not make out a name, he excitedly sent word to Carnarvon announcing the discovery of a tomb with its seal intact. Carter reburied the steps until Carnarvon's arrival on the 24th of November. The steps and doorway were uncovered to reveal the name of King Tutankhamun. As the excavation continued, Carter could not yet be certain that it was a tomb and not a cache of funerary goods from different kings, and he was disappointed to see signs that the tomb had been broken into before it was resealed. By the 26th of November, the entrance corridor had been cleared. Accompanied by Carnarvon and his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert, Carter poked a hole into the antechamber and asked for a candle. As he peered inside, he saw a glittering collection of golden treasures and could hardly believe his eyes. Carnarvon broke the silence and asked Carter if he could see anything, to which the archaeologist replied, "Yes, wonderful things." The following day, accompanied by an Egyptian official, Carter and Carnarvon became the first people to step inside Tutankhamun's tomb for well over 3,000 years. Carter and Carnarvon found signs that the burial chamber had been broken into, and in order to reassure themselves that the burial was still intact, they are alleged to have broken through the same opening before resealing it. An official opening of the tomb was then held on the 29th of November. The discovery was reported in the Times of London the following morning. As the man who discovered an intact royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings, Carter knew he had a great responsibility. He installed a steel gate at the tomb's entrance to bolster security, and he decided to document each item from the tomb in its original location and after it had been taken for examination. In this work, he was assisted by the chemist Alfred Lucas and the photographer Harry Burton, while a nearby tomb was commandeered to serve as a laboratory for the conservation and documentation of the artifacts. By the 16th of February 1923, the antechamber had been emptied of its contents and work could begin on the burial chamber. A number of factors hindered the work on Tutankhamun's tomb, including the attention of the world's press and the arrival of thousands of tourists and dignitaries keen to catch a glimpse of the golden treasures Carter had uncovered. Work was further delayed by the death of Lord Carnarvon after a mosquito bite on his face became infected. Lady Carnarvon was allowed to keep her late husband's permit, but work stopped amidst disputes between the Egyptian government and the Carnarvon estate over the distribution of the finds from the tomb. When the press claimed that Carnarvon had succumbed to an ancient curse, an irritated Carter insisted that the tomb was safe and no such curse existed. It wasn't until September 1925 that work began to remove the pharaoh's body from his coffins. After the lids of the first two coffins were removed, the golden innermost coffin was revealed in all its splendor. As the two inner coffins were stuck together by the resin used to seal the coffins, they were brought to the antechamber, where the lid of the golden coffin could be opened, revealing the mummy with its famous gold death mask on its head. Since the mummy itself was stuck to the golden coffin, Carter's workmen carried the two coffins into the laboratory. Unable to separate the mummy from the coffin, Carter decided to unwrap Tutankhamun inside his coffins, an operation carried out by the anatomist Douglas Derry and an Egyptian assistant. As layer after layer of the linen bandages were removed, the amulets and jewelry were collected for further analysis. By the time the king's corpse was revealed, it was found to be in very poor condition. In order to remove all the items found on the king's body, Carter's team had to dismember the body until the decapitated head remained still covered by the golden mask. Derry eventually separated the mask from the head with heated knives, revealing the face of the king whom he had just cut to pieces. It was not until 1932 that conservation work was finally completed on the tomb. But Carter's discovery had elevated the status of a relatively minor pharaoh, one who was forgotten for 3 millennia, to become the most widely known of all Egyptian rulers. A replica of the tomb's antechamber was made for the British Empire exhibition at Wembley Park in 1924 and 1925, while shops in London were full of merchandise bearing images of artifacts from the tomb, most notably the golden mask, which was first exhibited to the public in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo in January 1926. Carter reassembled Tutankhamun's body and returned it to the outermost coffin and the sarcophagus in the burial chamber. Carter died in March 1939, shortly before the outbreak of the Second World War. It is believed that during the war, the tomb was broken into and the body disturbed, and a team of researchers in 1968 found that the body was no longer in the position Carter had described when he returned it to the tomb. In January 2005, Tutankhamun was taken out of his tomb for CT scanning. In November 2007, Tutankhamun's body was moved into the antechamber for better preservation in a climate-controlled case. Pending the discovery of any new royal tombs, he is the only Egyptian pharaoh to be resting in his own tomb. In recent decades, researchers have used the data collected from Tutankhamun's body to draw conclusions about Tutankhamun's life and death. The theory that he had a club foot is supported by what appear to be numerous walking sticks found in his tomb. but it is possible that his remains were damaged either during the embalming process or by Carter's team, and that these sticks were actually used as symbols of royal authority rather than to help the king walk. Similarly, there are competing theories about the cause of his death. DNA testing suggests that he suffered from malaria, while a dislodged piece in his skull has fueled the belief that he was murdered, challenging the idea that his death was owing to a hunting accident. The absence of Tutankhamun's heart and damage to his rib cage points to a traumatic wound to the chest, though this may have been the result of damage to the mummy which occurred during the break-in during the Second World War. Although Tutankhamun's body remained in Egypt, the artifacts from his tomb have been exhibited abroad on several occasions, beginning in 1961 with a tour of North America, accompanied by a campaign to raise awareness for the conservation of archaeological sites impacted by the construction of the Aswan High Dam in Egypt. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, the treasures traveled to Europe, including London, Paris, and throughout the Soviet Union. Since the 1980s, Tutankhamun's famous gold mask has remained in Egypt, where it is expected to stay forever. But other items from the tomb have been exhibited internationally since 2004, until the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. The whole collection of artifacts from Tutankhamun's tomb, over 5,000 objects in total, is being prepared for display at the Grand Egyptian Museum, newly built near the pyramids of Giza. Over a century after Howard Carter's discovery of his tomb, the story of Tutankhamun's life is still being re-evaluated. New technology and scientific methods may uncover mysteries surrounding the brief life and reign of the pharaoh whose successors attempted to erase him from history. Likewise, there are many details about Tutankhamun's family members from the Amarna period that remain unknown, and the young pharaoh's parentage even remains a matter of debate. Thus, King Tutankhamun, despite being the most famous of all Egyptian pharaohs, whose death mask has become a symbol of ancient Egypt, remains something of a mysterious figure. He grew up in Akhenaten's court at Amarna, where he witnessed the establishment of the cult of Aten, the memory of which was later obliterated by his successors. After spending the first decade of his life accompanied by religious upheaval and political disorder, Tutankhamun came to the throne and began the process of restoring the old gods and disestablishing the cult of Aten, abandoning Amarna for the traditional political and religious centers of Memphis and Thebes. After his death at a very young age, his legacy as a man who began to restore the old religion was usurped by his advisors and successors, Horemheb in particular, who sought to erase Tutankhamun from history. For more than 3,000 years thereafter, Tutankhamun remained unknown and undisturbed, until Howard Carter's discovery of his tomb elevated him to a degree of international fame that easily eclipsed the significance of his own brief reign. What do you think of Tutankhamun? Was he the tragic boy king who spent most of his short reign controlled by his courtiers, or should he be recognized as an important historical figure in his own right, responsible for restoring a degree of political and religious order after the upheavals of Akhenaten's reign? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.